Welcome everyone to the Thursday, September 9th, 2021 regular meeting of the Boulder City Council. I only have one announcement tonight, and we will kick that off with COVID-19 vaccinations. They are obviously available and free, and if you would like more information on how to get a vaccine, please go to the website boco.org/COVID vaccine notify sign up. And I think that's actually two different things. I think that is the one to get notified, and then there's also a way to get the vaccine there. And then with that announcement being done, Alicia, could you please call the roll?
Yes, sir, and good evening, everyone. Councilmember Brockett.
Present.
Friend.
Here.
Joseph.
Present.
Councilmember Nagle is absent. Councilmember Swetlick.
Present.
Wallach.
Present.
Mayor Weaver.
Here.
Councilmember Yates.
Here.
And Councilmember Young.
Present.
Mayor, we have a quorum.
Thank you very much, Alicia. And the first order of business tonight is to amend the agenda. We need to add item 8B, which is a discussion on the Council Employee Evaluation Committee. So could I have a motion to amend the agenda?
So moved.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Are there any objections to amending the agenda? Great. Seeing none, we will make that amendment and we will move on to our next item, which is the declaration for the 2021 Pollinator Appreciation Month. And that is going to come from our beekeeper, Adam Swetlick. Adam?
Thanks, Sam. Well, I'm not officially a beekeeper. I do work for a small local honey company, so it's time for me to don my bee suit again and show how much we appreciate our pollinators. The 550 native bee species, butterflies, hummingbirds, beetles, flies, and other pollinators of Boulder maintain the health and beauty of our grasslands, forests, meadows, and other areas. Native pollinators and honeybees are indispensable partners in the production of our food supply. Pollinators are essential for the diverse and thriving ecosystems that support all life. Around the world, insects are declining precipitously, including critical pollinators, from habitat loss, pesticide use, and climate change. This is placing our food security, natural environment, and human well-being in peril. Urgent action is required by all of us. We must respond to the biodiversity and climate crises. We must develop innovative and equitable solutions to transform our food system and rewild our community's landscaping. We must provide high-quality wildlife habitat in both urban and natural lands, and we must act now. As our community enjoys the bountiful autumn harvest, and as we see the regeneration of our natural lands from the tireless work of pollinators, the City Council of the City of Boulder, Colorado declares September 2021 Pollinator Appreciation Month and commits to taking action by partnering with Boulder's residents, businesses, and organizations to join together to protect pollinators and all biodiversity for current and future generations. And as always, thank you to Taylor Ryman for putting together the declaration. I'm just here to read it.
Great. Thank you, Adam. And I think with that, we have Rella Abernathy, the city staff for integrated pest management here to accept the declaration. Rella.
Thank you, Mayor Weaver and Council Member Swetlick and council members tonight. I'm joining you from the Goss Grove Pollinator Pathway neighborhood, where we have some a crowd here of our volunteers. And our committed community members who work tirelessly to help us create the programs and the gardens that are just necessary to change things and support biodiversity and have natural solutions for climate. So I'd like to first thank the Bee Chicas who have, for the last 7 years, Without them, we wouldn't have Pollinator Appreciation Month or the Bee Festival. So here tonight we have Deborah Foy, Cynthia Scott, and Deborah and Teresa Beck. We're missing Tracy Bellahumer. And in addition to this important work, we're really moving into a direction now of creating habitat throughout the city. And we couldn't do that without people who are just taking the lead and working themselves day and night to make this happen. You know, we're passionate volunteers. And so I wanted to introduce Andrea Montoya, who's the director of the Goss Grove Pollinator Pathway Project, and who is responsible for putting in these beautiful gardens in our city-owned parks. So, yeah, I'm going to have you talk to Andrea now.
Hi there, my name's Andrea Montoya. Thank you for sponsoring our event tonight and Pollinator Appreciation Month. I am the director of the Goss Grove Pollinator Corridor Project. These are the volunteers and people that we couldn't do this project without. I'd also like to thank Rella Abernathy for her undying commitment to this project. She connects people across the city and the community. I'm going to give you a little bit of history about who we are. These pocket parks were first built in the city of Boulder because they were traffic diversion islands. We had traffic going back and forth from Arapahoe to Canyon, and the city said, we're going to put in these little pocket parks, and these pocket parks will give you some peace and quiet. Well, over the years, over the dozens of years that they've been here, they fell into disarray. And not only did they fall into disarray, but they fell into disuse. They stopped being community spaces, and they never really quite developed into anything that the community could use. In addition to that, we have lots of neighbors around here that have yards with gardens in them. And though they had beautiful gardens with plants, none of it was really connected. It was more like we were individuals with yards and nothing really hung together. About 3 or 4 years ago, I started to take real notice of the fact that climate destruction was causing a tremendous fall off of pollinator habitat and pollinators across our city, across the globe. And I wanted to do something about it. So it was kind of a perfect storm. Here we had neighbors who were willing to plant gardens. We had pocket parks that had fallen into disarray. We had a community of people that needed more connecting. And we also had pollinators that needed biodiverse habitat. So we sunk our heels in, we got out our shovels, and we committed ourselves to turning these pocket parks, you can kind of see them in the background, into real live biodiverse habitat full of native plants that grow around here, around this area, and can serve the native pollinators like native bees,
Uh-oh. It looks like we may have lost connection. Can you all hear me? Okay, great. Just making sure it wasn't on my end. Well, with that, I guess we will have an abrupt end to our celebration with Rella, but I want to say thanks to Adam and to Rella for the declaration, and thanks to everyone who's helping support our pollinators. So with Rachel.
I just wanted to say, Adam, you will be missed in future years. I don't know who could possibly do this as well as you. Thanks.
Yeah, this is probably one of my favorite things. I appreciate that, Rachel. If you ever need a guest appearance, I'm happy to do it.
I vote we invite him back for this.
Yeah, and this is one big loss doing it on Zoom, because we often would have many people show up in costume, just like Adam is now in council chambers. So we're looking forward to getting back to that.
Thanks for the ears, Bob.
All right. And so with that, we will move on to the next item. David Gross is here with us, and he will present to us the comprehensive annual financial report, and then talk to us, answer questions, and talk to us about the selection of next year's auditor. So with that, I guess I'll turn to you first, Nuria, and see if you want to tee this up at all.
I don't. I think we can go right into it unless Cheryl has something to add, but I think we're proud of what we've done financially. I know that there are always improvements, and I believe that our CAFRs kind of shows everything that we're doing as we move forward as strong fiscal accountability.
All right, David, it's all you. Take it away.
Thank you. I think Ryan needs to turn my video back on. Oh, there it is. Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Great. All right. Well, thank you for this opportunity. So my name is David Gross, and I serve on the Boulder City Council Audit Subcommittee. The committee consists of council members Swetlick, Wallach, Yates, and me, and it's our job to assess and interpret the audit of the city's fiscal year 2020 financial statements. It's not the job of this committee to in any way assess the city's financial position or to assess its financial activities, just the quality of the statements and the audit of those statements. So the motion on the consent agenda for later this evening is to approve and accept the City of Boulder Annual Comprehensive Financial Report, or the ACFR, and also the audit of the ACFR. So note that this is the 6th year that Clifton Larson Allen has audited the city's financial statements, and it's best practice to review auditors and consider a change after 5 years, and the committee did this last fall. After careful consideration of several firms across several factors, including expertise, compatibility, and cost, the committee unanimously approved to renew Boulder's relationship with Clifton Larson Allen. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give a brief description of the 4-part process that led us to this point. So first, city staff records all financial transactions. Second, the staff uses this information to prepare the financial statements. These financial statements are produced for each of the city's 41 funds, including the general fund and the open space and the transportation and municipal property, in addition to a combined set of financial statements. There are 3 main financial statements that are produced for a government entity like this. So kind of like a P&L or an income statement is something called the Statement of Revenue, Expenses, and Change in Net Position. All revenue transactions are recorded and summarized and categorized by source. All expenses are categorized by type. And from these, the staff computes the resulting net change in fund balance, meaning how much more or less did the fund end up with relative to where it started. So like a balance sheet, the city also produces a statement of net position. And this is what the city owns, its assets, and what the city owes, its liabilities, and the resulting net position. If this were a business, we'd call the net position owner's equity. The difference between this year's net position and last year's net position is the change in net position that we saw on the P&L statement above. The third financial statement that's produced is something called the Statement of Cash Flows. And the Statement of Cash Flows can be an important addition to the other 2 financial statements to assess the true financial health of an entity. So if an entity has lots of non-cash revenues or lots of non-cash expenses, meaning transactions on credit, and an entity that appears healthy, that appears profitable, or appears to have enough money, can run out of money waiting to get paid. This isn't the case for the City of Boulder. The city does not have a lot of non-cash transactions, but it still must produce this Statement of Cash Flows. So these 3 types of statements for all of the different funds, these are public. They can be used by anyone to understand how the city operates and answer questions about the city. From where does the city receive its funds? Where does the city spend its funds? And how stable and sustainable, financially stable and sustainable, is this city? But these and other questions can only be answered if the city is accurately recording transactions and producing the financial statements correctly. So the third process is to give these financial statements to the auditor. In addition, the auditor works with the city staff to gain an understanding of the process used to record the transactions and prepare the financial statements. And it's the auditor's job to ensure that the recording and preparation are done in accordance with the rules set by the Government Accounting Standards Board, or GASB. So the results of the audit: the auditors gave a clean opinion. This is the best possible result for the city. So summarizing the opinion on page 18 of the 311-page Annual Comprehensive Financial Report, or the ACFR, In our opinion, the financial statements fairly in all material respects represent the true financial position of the government activities, the business type activities, each major fund, and the aggregate remaining fund information of the city of Boulder. This is the best possible report opinion that the auditors could have. Now, there was something called an uncorrected misrepresentation. It sounds a lot worse than it is, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So the auditors look for deficiencies, significant deficiencies, and material weakness. A deficiency is a flaw in the design of a process that might allow for errors. It doesn't mean that there was an error. But if they find something like this, they issue a comment on it. So in 2015, the auditors found 14 deficiencies associated with IT processes. The city worked extremely hard to address these. The 14 was down to 8 by 2017, 4 by 2018, 0 for 2019, and again, 0 deficiencies for 2020. A significant deficiency is a large deficiency or a combination of them, less severe than a material weakness, but yet important enough to merit attention. And again, no significant deficiencies. And finally, a material weakness is a large deficiency or combinations such that not only did this happen, but there's a reasonable probability that errors occurred. And again, no material weaknesses. So to recap, legacy deficiencies for 2015 are all fixed and there's no new ones, no significant deficiencies, no material weaknesses. Now, there was one misstatement of the financial statements that went uncorrected, and this is called an uncorrected misstatement. So what happened was Boulder County did $224,000 worth of work for the city in December 2020, but the county didn't send the invoice until March 2021 after the books were closed. The city paid the invoice in April 2021, but the city should have booked a liability, a payable, for this amount in December 2020. And it should have shown up in the December 2020 financial statements. But since no invoice was sent, no accounting entry occurred. So the 2020 expenses, which is what we're talking about now, should have been $224,000 higher. But since total expenses were over $311 million, this represents 0.07% of expenses. So when this relatively small timing issue was discovered in the auditing process, it was deemed correctly to have no material impact on the reported financial position of the city, and it's going to be included next year. But there does remain one uncorrected misstatement, but again, doesn't have a real impact. So overall, a clean opinion, and for the 31st consecutive year, 38 years in total, the city was awarded the Certificate of Achievement for Excellence in Financial Reporting by the Government Finance Officers Association. So this certifies that the city went beyond the minimum requirements and prepared reports that evidence the spirit of transparency and full disclosure. Just an aside, one other concern this fiscal year that the committee had was internal controls. And internal controls are the processes which make it more difficult or hopefully impossible for people to engage in theft. So for example, a single person is not allowed to determine the amount of cash to be collected, collect the cash, and then deposit it in the bank. Given the enormous procedural changes necessitated by COVID and the move to remote work, the committee was concerned that these changes might decrease internal controls, but both the city and the city staff and the auditors were able to allay these concerns. For example, there weren't a lot of cash transactions in 2020, and so this seems like it was dealt with well. So the fourth and final step is the audit committee interprets and acts on any recommendations from the auditor. There weren't any. The audit committee then makes a recommendation to the full council on whether to accept the annual comprehensive financial report and the audit of the annual comprehensive financial report. And it's the unanimous recommendation of the audit committee that the city council approve and accept this report and the audit of this report. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dave. And before we go to council questions or feedback, would you mind telling us, I know that you help us out with this, but you have a day job. Would you mind telling us the expertise that you bring to the work that you do with the city?
Yeah, I'm a teaching professor, associate teaching professor of finance at CU. I have been teaching graduate and undergraduate finance for 6 years now, up there on the Hill.
Oh, great. We so appreciate the time that you take to help look from the outside and make sure that our processes are stable. It looks like they're getting better every year, which is great. And to get that certificate of high regard from the government financial officers is wonderful. So I want to thank you and thank the whole committee. I was on the audit committee for 3 or 4 years, and there's a lot of detail that has to be tracked there. And with that, I will turn to council and members of the audit committee and see if anyone has questions or feedback. Aaron.
Well, I'd just like to echo my thanks. Dave, we just so much appreciate your service to the city and bringing your expertise to bear and assisting us with this audit. And just a huge kudos to the financial department of the city. The audits have gotten better every single year, and to have such a clean report, and it's an extraordinary accomplishment. So very appreciative of the phenomenal work by city staff at this.
Great. Thank you, Aaron. Mary.
Yeah, I wanted to thank Dave. So thank you, Dave. Awesome work. And this couldn't happen without an amazing staff behind it. So I wanted to thank our finance staff for the stellar work that they do on an ongoing basis. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Mary. Seeing no other question. Oh, there's Mark. Mark, jump in.
Sorry, I had to unmute. I also want to thank our finance staff. They were at the committee level. They were very, very forthcoming, and the information they produced was terrific. And I want to thank Dave as well for his terrific expertise and helping us navigate this process. I actually have one question. Starting in 2022, we're going to be subject to a change in the way leases are recorded. It's called, you're probably familiar with it. I am not, Gatsby Statement 87. And it was apparently significant enough that our auditors had a large section of boilerplate warning us that we had to be prepared for that. Is there anything special that we have to be prepared for? Is that an ordinary course of business adjustment that we will have to make?
I'm going to let Cheryl answer that.
Okay, that would be great.
Yeah, so thanks, Mark, and thanks everyone for your comments and feedback tonight. And Dr. Gross, I couldn't have explained it better than you did, so thank you. So this is a pretty big lift for the entire city, in that, in the past we've just had to record our major capital leases, and now we're pretty much having to go throughout the city and determine all the leases that we have and record those. So it certainly is something that we've been planning for. Actually, the GASB delayed it due to COVID, so we are on it, and we will be ready for implementation next year.
Cheryl, do you think it'll have any major impact on the financial statement itself?
I don't think so, but I'm going to defer to Ann Penny, our controller. She may have other thoughts.
I think from the annual financial report standpoint, you will see changes at the government-wide level, much like you do with the pension expense that we have to record at that level. But from a fund statement perspective, I don't think you'll see much of a change at that level.
Thanks.
Sure.
Thank you.
The point of this is to account more transparently for things that didn't show up on the balance sheet. So if I sign a 10-year lease, I have a commitment to make this payment. If I bought the building, I would have a commitment to make mortgage payments. And economically, they're not that much different, but legally they are. And so what happened was lots of entities were essentially leasing a building that someone else owned, but effectively using it for the whole life of the building, and they could avoid putting the building on their balance sheet. And so capitalizing leases, or coming up with capital leases, is a way to ensure that entities are correctly stating and reporting their financial obligations like they would a mortgage. Now they have to report a lease contract.
Thank you.
Very good. Well, thank you again, Dr. Gross, and to our entire finance team. Thank you so much for all the work you did pulling this all together. It is a great accomplishment. And I have to say, Dr. Gross, you get so excited about the audit work and the accounting that you must make a great professor.
Well,
So
thanks.
thank you for your time. And with that, Alicia, I think we're ready to move to open comment. Is that correct? Okay.
That is correct, sir.
Oh,
The mute
thank
button.
And we have 3 people for open comment tonight. As usual, open comment is always 2 minutes. So our 3 speakers will be Gary Erling, William Sales, and Patrick Murphy. Each of you get 2 minutes. And Gary Erling, you are up.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you.
I got it delayed on mute. I wanted to talk to you about the dining, outdoor dining on Pearl Street. We've had major change in the number of people, especially non-resident people visiting Pearl. Now, the Pearl open dining went in place without any, well, it was kind of an emergency, and it went into effect without any study. And there were a lot of unintended consequences. And if you drive streets in our neighborhood, you will see what happened was it was turned into a big parking lot with no space for neighbors. Some of us don't even have driveways or parking spaces, and nothing seems to be being done about it. And we now hear there's talk about a 3-year extension. Now, I know there's lots of open parking lots. There's lots of downtown parking, but the people who come here primarily from out of state don't want to pay, and they aren't in any way encumbered by the threat of a possible ticket. They just leave. So I think we need to really take into consideration this. I think we need to take into consideration how many empty tables there are at different times on Pearl Street. Well, our blocks are never unparked. And as I said, you have a lot of open parking options. City parking, you have a hospital site with a huge empty parking lot. You have an Alfalfa's parking lot that's never being used. And I can't even count the number of parking lots, public and private, that could be used. If they were free, people would use them. And if there was on-site traffic monitoring, which the NPP does not do. Anyway, thank you. I think you need to look at this.
Thank you, Gary. Next up, we have William Sales and Patrick Murphy. William?
And we do not have William or Patrick here. Not seeing them in the meeting. We do have Lynn Siegel, who is interested in speaking for open comment.
Okay, well, let's bring Lynn in because she's only signed up 2 other times. So Lynn, you have 2 minutes.
Yeah, I didn't get the information for this meeting as being separate. There was no notification that you have to have a certain time to sign up for open comment ahead of a meeting that's off axis to what it usually is. I wanted to talk to you about CU South. One of the things that I found out today is that if there's a de-annexation, there's a change in what happens with the de-annexation, that if the land disposal happens, that it will not be in effect, that it wasn't in effect. And if there's a de-annexation, the Open Space Board of Trustees will have had to go through all this process for nothing and without having the land disposal of the 119 acres. This is a new change, It was brought up at Open Space Board of Trustees by Hal Hallstein last night at 8:50. So you can listen to his review of that. But I imagine that if it's de-annexed because CDOT doesn't approve it, and then it's de-annexed, well, then you could think, well, yeah, if it's de-annexed, then why should we still get the 119 acres? But if we spent the time to process all of this information with CU South, they should have to pay the liability of all of the time that's been spent for this last year of us trying to get this annexation through. Supposedly, according to them, we're the ones that want the annexation, not them. According to us, it's them that wants the annexation. So I'm kind of confused. There's so many moving parts to this annexation, and it's changing all the time.
Lynn, your time is up. Thank you for your comments. They're appreciated. And you can send the rest of them in to us by email if you would like. Ryan, have either of the other two speakers shown up?
They have not.
Okay, very good. We will move on in a moment. Aaron, I see your hand. I was going to turn to staff and council, but would you like to speak before?
Oh, I just feel like we need to make an entry in the Boulder City Council Book of Records to only have 2 people at open comment. I don't know where our citizens are today. That's very, very unusual.
Well, hopefully they're doing something fun. With that, we will bring open comment to a close, and I will turn to Nuria and Sandra and see, does staff any response?
Not at this time, but always appreciate open comment.
No comment here. Thank you.
Great. Council, any feedback? Okay, seeing none. Alicia, take us to the next item, please.
All right, sir. Our next item on this agenda tonight is item number 3, the consent agenda. That includes items A through F.
Super, very good. And Bob, I see you got a hand up.
I just wanted to announce that I'm going to recuse myself from item 3C.
Awesome, thank you. Any other council comments, questions? Junie, did you have the, were you going to recuse from 3C as well?
Yes, I was going to make the comment at some point during voting. Yes.
Okay, super. All right, with that.
Can you hear me?
Just barely. You were a bit choppy, but I understood that you were going to recuse yourself as well.
She said with the voting.
With the voting, okay. Junie, you are fairly frozen. I don't know if you need to leave the meeting and come back in.
I'll follow up with Junie separately.
Okay, super. Well, with that, council, we're the consent agenda. Any comments, questions, or we take a motion on the consent agenda?
I move the consent agenda.
Second.
All right, we have a motion and a second, and I think I will wait a couple of minutes to see if we can get Junie back into the meeting so we can be clear on her recusal if one exists. And just for folks who are listening, the item that Bob is going to recuse himself from 3C is calling a special meeting on September 14th, which will be for the public hearing of the CU South annexation, which is why Bob and
I'm
Junie.
here. Can you hear me
All
now?
right. Yes, we can hear you now.
Yeah, sorry about that. I'll just keep my camera off so that you can hear me better. And yes, I will be recusing myself from 3C. Thank you.
Very good. And Junie, while you were gone, we had a motion and a second for the consent agenda. So I believe we're ready to take a vote on that. Is that correct, Alicia? And it's a roll call?
Yes, sir, it is. Mayor Weaver,
Aye.
Councilmember Yates,
Aye on all items other than 3C, for which I'm recusing myself.
thank you, sir. Councilmember Young,
Yes.
Brockett,
Aye.
Friend,
Yes.
Joseph,
Aye, except for 3C.
thank you. Sweatlick,
Aye.
and Wallach.
Aye.
Mayor, the consent agenda is approved 8-1, except for the recusals of council members Yates and Joseph on item 3C.
Super. And I just want to make sure, I believe it was 8-0 for all of the items and 7-0 for 3C, correct?
It would be 6-0 for other than 3C, because we have 8 present and the 2 recusals.
2 recusals. Thank you. Perfect. Exactly. Awesome. Okay.
All righty. Thank you for keeping me straight as well. All right. Next on our agenda, we have our call up and check-in items under number 4 on this agenda. 4A is the call up item for site review, case number LUR 2020-00052, to partially redevelop a portion of the property at 3485 Stanford Court with 60 permanently affordable apartments for seniors age 55 plus in one new building. The proposed units include 54 one-bedroom units and 6 two-bedroom units. The original sanctuary building is proposed to be landmarked and renovated for the existing child care, Rainbow Child Care Center on the lower level and new community space for residents on the upper level. The proposal includes a request for an increase in maximum allowable building height to allow a height of 45 feet 10 inches for the proposed building.
Very good. Thank you, Alicia and Nuria. I believe, do we have a staff presentation?
We do. We're going to eventually hear from Ian Swallow, but I believe Jacob popped up as well and might want to frame this for us in a better way.
Thank you so much, Nuria. Good evening, Mayor Weaver, members of council. I'm actually going to hand this off to Sloan Walbert from Planning and Development Services, who has a few slides for us this evening.
Apologies, Jacob.
Thank you, Jacob. Emily, would you mind bringing that presentation up for me? All right, there we go. Okay, so good evening, council. The purpose of tonight's item is for council to consider whether to call up planning board's decision on the site review application that Alicia described, which is to partially develop a portion of the property at 3485 Stanford Court, which was formerly the site of the Mount Calvary Church. And this presentation will just be a brief overview of the site review proposal and the planning board determination. Next slide, please. So just to provide the context, the nearly 5-acre site is located in South Boulder at the northernmost terminus of Stanford Court. One of the most notable aspects of the site is the topography and the natural slope to the north and to the east. The site is relatively level at that southwestern quadrant of the site, which is where the redevelopment is proposed. The site contains 2 former church structures. Here you can see that original church sanctuary constructed in 1957, which is proposed to remain and be landmarked. And then you can see that church addition constructed in 2001, which is proposed to be demolished. Next slide. The proposal is for 60 permanently affordable apartments for seniors, which would be persons over the age of 55, and to maintain that existing child care facility on site. The original sanctuary building would be renovated to house that child care use and also to provide some new community space. The proposal includes 3 requested modifications to the land use code. The first is a height modification to permit a building of a height nearly 46 feet. The second is a parking reduction to allow the provision of 59 vehicular parking spaces where 83 spaces are required, which is a 29.3% reduction. And lastly, a bike parking reduction to allow the provision of 79 bicycle parking spaces where 124 are required. In terms of parking, the applicant has submitted a parking management plan that describes how parking would be managed and shared between the uses on the site, which would include residents, but also Boulder Housing Partner staff, childcare staff, and visitors. And the parking reduction is based on that senior population served, transportation demand management strategies, and overall access to services, transit, and multimodal connections. Next slide, please. In terms of building design, the building is contemporary in style, but also designed to be compatible with the existing historic sanctuary. The roof is predominantly flat with some sloped shed roof elements that sort of break up the mass and also provide for screening of rooftop mechanical equipment. Next slide. Oops. And then on that note, the applicant, as I said, is requesting a height modification. The proposed height is 45 feet and 10 inches, which is, just as a reminder, is based on how the city calculates height, which takes the low point within 25 feet of the building and measures to the highest point of the building. And the proposal is eligible for a height modification because at least 40% of the floor area of the building would be used for units that meet the requirements of permanently affordable units. And the height modification is necessary to achieve 2 objectives. The first is that the design of the building incorporates those pitched roofs to sort of support that architectural compatibility with the historic structure in the existing neighborhood. And as I mentioned, the other portion would be because of the topography and how the city measures height. So this chart just sort of shows you the 2 different components of the height modification. Next slide, please. So in terms of process, the project is required to complete a site review, both based on the size of the property and also the number of units proposed. Because of the height modification, the final decision was by the planning board. On August 5th, the planning board held a public hearing and approves the application unanimously with a vote of 5-0. And at the hearing, the board discussed whether the proposal meets the site review criteria and the criteria for parking reductions. They also discussed the proposed height modification and also the need to maintain pedestrian access across the site for use by the neighborhood. And there was an additional condition added to ensure that no obstructions would be placed on that pedestrian connection through the site. Next slide, please. In terms of the public process, formal public notification was provided as part of the concept plan review and also the site review. Neighborhood comment was given as part of the concept plan, and the applicant has worked to address these through the site review process. And very little public comment was received by staff through the site review, although 2 individuals did speak in support at the planning board hearing. And outside of the formal process, BHP has undergone public outreach for the project, which the applicant is available to discuss if desired by council. Next slide. And as I mentioned, that concept plan was reviewed by planning board in June of last year. And city council discussed the proposal at the July 7th, 2020 meeting, but did not call up the item for consideration at a public hearing. And in terms of other necessary processes, the vacation of right-of-way has been completed, and the designation for that historic sanctuary is on track to go to the Landmarks Board at the October 6th meeting dates, which would then go to council within 100 days. And if there is no call-up tonight, the project would move into the technical document and permitting processes. So that's all I have for tonight, but happy to answer any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Sloan. Make sure that, yep, okay. And I see two hands up. I've got Adam and Mark. Adam?
Thanks, Sam. I know some of the main concerns about this area were the access from Table Mesa, and especially that this is going to house seniors, that there may be more ambulance traffic that has to be sort of anticipated. Was anything prepared in that regard? Or I realize I don't think there's any additional access points provided in this plan, but I wanted to see if that was taken into consideration.
Well, there wasn't a traffic study done, but there was a review by city staff to ensure that there was safe and appropriate access across the site. So they do have, when you're entering the site, there is a sort of entry plaza where an ambulance would be able to pull in. It's also been reviewed by the fire marshal to ensure that an emergency vehicle would be able to get through the site.
Okay, and this may not be a question for you, Sloan, but are there any anticipated traffic improvements for that street that connects to Table Mesa, just since it is a pretty highly trafficked area and it's kind of a mixture of people going a little fast in a residential neighborhood?
Right, so because that portion of roadway is not part of this property, they wouldn't be doing improvements there. I will say that the possibility of improvements on the sort of public side was evaluated by the transportation department, and they determined that that wasn't necessary at this point, but it's certainly something that we could reevaluate once this has been developed.
Okay, and my last question is, there was sort of a community park, even though it wasn't an officially established park or anything, on the west side of this property. Are community members still going to have access to that, or does this plan in any way mitigate that function?
That might be a good question for BHP on how they sort of intend to manage the site.
Yeah, I can take that one, Sloan. Good evening, members of council. Ian Swallow with Boulder Housing Partners. And Adam, I think what you're referring to, there was kind of a historical, not historic, but historic for the property, community gardens over on that west side. They've gotten pretty overgrown in the last couple of years, but our intent, we're actually moving where the community gardens would be, so they'd be a little more central in the site. And then we would look to make a portion of those beds would be available for the community, just because they would potentially be losing access there. You'll note, if you look closely at our demolition plans, there's one note on there that says we'll be moving the dirt from those gardens, saving that kind of good soil and moving it to where the new gardens would be. So I think we think that's a good solution, and one that'll serve both the seniors as well as kind of the broader community out there.
Thanks for that, Ian. And that did remind me of one more thing. Is there any plan for, there's sort of a path that goes to the north on that property? It's, not a designated path in any way. I was just wondering if there's any plans for that, if it's just going to be sort of shuttered, or if you have any idea.
Yeah, no, I think it is certainly not going to be shuttered. That was a big kind of focal point of our site plan. So that path will remain. It'll get slightly reconfigured so that it'll bring folks up from the bottom of the hill down on Dover there. They'll be able to come up through the site, walk through kind of the entry courtyard, and still be able to cut across to the Table Mesa intersection and kind of that shopping center. So our intent is that stays, that's public. The path will be improved, but it's not going to be concrete. It'll be like a crusher fine path, so it'll maintain that kind of natural feel out there. And we would welcome members of the public in the neighborhood to continue using that once the site's redeveloped.
All right, that's all I have. Thank you, Ian, and thank you, Sloan.
Thanks, Adam. Next, we have Mark and Rachel. Mark?
My first question was going to be on the community garden, so I thank Adam for asking it, and I appreciated your response, Ian. With respect to other questions, not taking into account the slope, what is the height of the physical structures?
The proposed structure, is that?
Yeah, I'm just, would it be within the 38-foot limitation if not for the way we calculate it in terms of 25 feet from the buildings themselves?
So in this district, the limitation is 35 feet. And even if you were measuring from grade, the building would be over that. And the rationale for that would be they could design a building with flat roofs straight across to meet the height limitation. But in order to meet that compatibility with the historic sanctuary building and do some screening of the mechanical equipment, they would still be over height limitation. I'm trying to do the calculation of where they would be. Do you know off the top of your head, JV?
Yeah, thank you, everyone. My name is JV DeSouza. I'm the architect, the lead architect on the project. And I don't remember the precise numbers, Sloan, but it was only about a foot to between 12 and 18 inches when we had an entirely flat roof on top of the structure. We did add the sloped roof elements, actually at the request of the community, to have sloped roofs on the building and to use those to screen our mechanical equipment, which caused them to count towards the height of the structure, whereas if it had been a standard mechanical screen fence on the roof, it would not have been considered part of the building height.
So essentially a good portion or most of that height increase that you're seeking is for the architectural elements and screening.
That's correct.
Okay. And my last question is on the parking. You have 59 spots. I assume residents will have some proportion of those spots. Are they going to have guaranteed spots, or is it going to be, between staff and visitors and residents, kind of a come one, come all proposition each day?
Yeah, I can answer that, Mark. So we looked pretty closely at the parking out here. I think we knew that was a big concern for the neighborhood and this site and the context out there. So where we landed, we looked at a number of our other senior properties. We found we typically see about 0.6 cars per unit at our senior properties. So for the residents, that's about 36 spaces. We looked at the childcare use, their staffing needs, as well as what BHP staffing needs might be. What we found is that we think the maximum number of folks at a peak time out there would be about 45 cars. What we wanted to do is make sure, that if that's the max, we provide some buffer just to be sure we're meeting the needs out there, but also not providing too much parking at the site. So we can still have those gardens. We have some really nice walking paths that without the parking reduction really wouldn't have been possible. So I think we're at a sweet spot with the 59 spaces to meet need, but also make sure there's enough.
But how many did you assume for the residents? 36?
It's about 36, and that's an average looking at other BHP sites. But we typically, with our senior housing communities, we do not see a very high car ownership percentage.
So you're looking at about 23 spots for visitors, staff, etc.
Yeah, that's right. So, and, I think we would probably have one full-time property manager who is on the site. The childcare has, depending on the day, between 4 and 7 staff who would be there. And then it's primarily a drop-off use for that childcare. It's a pretty locally served demographic. So you do have folks dropping kids off in cars, but you also have a lot of families who are walking or biking to the site. So I think we feel like that'll work pretty well out there.
Okay, thank you. That's what I got.
Thank you, Mark. Rachel.
My question was similar to Mark's. I was wondering about the parking reduction, and also why do bike reduction at the same time as car parking reductions? That just jumped out as a little strange to me.
Yeah, I can answer that as well. So, I think the bike parking reduction jumps out as a big number, but I would say we're still providing quite a bit of bike parking. So I think we have 45 indoor secured bike parking spaces for the residents, as well as several kind of outdoor bike parking areas. The reason we ended up there was, again, we kind of looked around at our senior properties to see what bike ownership looks like. It's a very small number. It's not typical that our senior residents are biking. I think we also didn't want to say we don't need any. I think we've seen trends in e-bikes increasing, and I think that will only continue for the senior population. So we think 45 covered spaces in the building is a good number, that will meet the need for the seniors. It also allows us to kind of keep the building footprint a little smaller, kind of minimize the bulk of the building, while still, I think, more than meeting the need that we'll see for bike parking out there.
Okay, maybe that just surprises me because I think the population age is 55 plus, and I know a lot of people who bike well into 70s and 80s. So if I guess maybe a follow-up question is, if it turns out that you need more bike parking spaces, what would happen?
So if we needed more, I think we would look to add it on the outside. We have quite a bit of space in some of the terraces. And then, the other point that I would just mention here is these are formal bike parking spaces. What we see oftentimes is people prefer to keep their bikes in their unit rather than locking them up in like a formal bike parking place. So, our 1-bedroom units are about 700 square feet, so they're quite large. So I think you would see someone who is an avid cyclist would probably keep their bike in their unit and not even utilize those spaces. But I do think we would have room on the site should 3, 4, or 5 years down the road we say, everything's full, the racks are full. We could certainly come in and add some additional parking for bikes.
Okay, thanks.
All right, thank you, Rachel. And if there's no other comments, I just want to say thanks to BHP for bringing this forward. Thank you so much for reusing that sanctuary building. We've had a couple successful projects in the last handful of years, decade or so, where those houses of worship that have been preserved have been really great amenities on the site. So I think this is a fantastic project, and the height is a minor issue in some sense, but it does definitely 100% affordable, definitely provides a community benefit for that little extra bit of height. So again, thank you so much, Sloan, for walking us through this, and Ian for being here. And with that, back to you, Alicia. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me double check. I haven't heard any desire to call it up. Does anyone desire to call this project up? Okay, there we go. Now, Alicia, you can take us on to the next item.
All right, sir, thank you. Next, we have item 4B, which is the vacation of a 20-foot utility easement in the rear yard at 2100 Emerald Road in order to allow for an ADU associated with AUR 2021-00003, referenced ADR 2021-00083.
Very good. Any council member want to call this up, speak to it? Great, seeing none. I don't think there's a call up here, Alicia, and we're ready for the next item.
All right, sir, thank you. Item number 5 on tonight's agenda is our public hearings. 5A is the introduction, first reading, and consideration of a motion to order published by title only, Ordinance 8488, approving supplemental appropriations to the 2021 budget, including appropriations of the American Rescue Plan Act funds.
Thank you. Nuria, I believe this is you, right?
Yep, and we've got, and hopefully I'll get it right this time, we've got 2 great presenters, Cara Skinner in finance, and then as many of you know, Mark Wolf has been kind of our project lead on ARPA. And while he's currently in Community Vitality, it is my great pleasure to say that he will be joining the finance team as of September 20th as our new senior budget manager. So kudos to Mark, but really the team has done a lot of good work on this.
Thank you, Nuria. I will kick off the presentation. Emily, if you could bring that up for us. Thank you very much. So good evening, Council. We reviewed this special ATB request at the August 24th study session. So our presentation this evening will be brief. Next slide. The request before you is to appropriate funding for 4 purposes. I will review the first 3, the service restorations, restorative payments, and the airport fund project. And then Mark will go over the initial ARPA uses. This request asks to appropriate just over $6 million from the general fund from additional revenue, approximately $2 million from sales and use tax revenue that is exceeding budget or expected to exceed budget, and $4 million from the city's ARPA allocation. It also requests a total of nearly $1.9 million from 22 restricted funds, from additional revenue, and from fund balance. Next slide. The special ATB requests to restore services are detailed in your agenda memo, but in total, the general fund requests are across 7 departments and total just over 1.1 million. And requests for other restricted funds are across 5 funds and total nearly 300,000. Next slide. The special ATB includes funding to start restoring services, and importantly, I would add, and we talked about this in August, restoring positions and hiring staff so we have the capacity to restore services. Here are just some examples of services that would be restored and phased back in through this appropriation and the 2022 budget. And that is library services, arts, including programs and cultural grants, parks and recreation, including recreation services, forestry and urban parks maintenance, staff to support the reopening of the Penfield Tate II Municipal Building, and our Age Well Center to support programming. Next slide. Next, we are requesting an appropriation totaling 1.7 million across all funds for a one-time payment to current employees for the 2020 extended holiday furlough days that they took. We do want to note that since the August 24th meeting, we have identified that there are current seasonal and temporary workers whose hours were impacted by the extended holiday furlough, and funding for payments for those impacted employees has been added to the general fund request. And then last, the airport has requested an $800,000 appropriation from fund balance for a time-sensitive fuel farm project. This project would potentially later be as part of our ATB2 in November, but there was some sense of urgency to appropriate these dollars now and move the project forward. And with that, I will hand it over to Mark to review the initial ARPA uses.
Thank you, Cara, and we can go to the next slide. Good evening again, Council. As Cara mentioned, we covered a lot of this on August 24th, so I will just briefly go through a few of these slides which outline our initial recommended allocation of our local relief funds through ARPA. Next slide, please. This slide should look familiar to you. This represents the City of Boulder's local relief funds through ARPA in total, a little over $20 million. Tonight, we're seeking approval of appropriation of the highlighted portions. That's gap funding for limited service restorations, a little over $2 million in immediate needs, and $1 million public health reserve to address any challenges or expenditures that arise related to Delta variant or other variants in the coming months. We did discuss $1 million reserve for emerging needs. Based on council feedback, we are not seeking authorization for expenditure this evening. If there are emerging needs that arise over the coming months, there are other opportunities through adjustments, subsequent adjustments to base that we'll be back and seeking approval for that at that time. What we are not talking about tonight is this the large green area, or the remaining dollars for transformative investment, which we are pursuing planning for in the coming months in the areas of behavioral and mental health, small business support, addressing digital divide across the city, and other initiatives that address some of our most pressing challenges in our community. Next slide, please. As mentioned before, we're seeking to apply ARPA dollars in very limited areas for restoration of services, the largest being in our recreation services to get us through the next several months and hopefully begin to see some of the revenue come back through the restoration of service. Funding for our severe weather shelter to expand our bed capacity, including hotel rooms in case there is that need due to social distance requirements throughout the winter months, and then some smaller amounts for neighborhood grants and public art maintenance. Next slide, please. We are seeking to apply ARPA dollars to a little over $2 million in immediate needs, largest being addressing the digital divide at several BHP sites throughout the city. Additional assistance to small businesses to support our local economic recovery in several areas, including expanded and pilot programming in affordable commercial, expansion of our microloan program, and programming to encourage safe visitation to the community. We are looking at a program to assist folks with utility bills, continuing programming that we funded through our CVRF allocation in human services in the areas of food, childcare, and healthcare access, and lastly, some additional dollars to support services through hybrid work delivery. Next slide, please. And our last slide is our requested motion for this evening. Happy to take any questions. Cara and I are both available for those. Thank you.
Great. Thank you both so much for that presentation. And council, do we have any questions? Mark.
Cara, what is the nature of the appropriation for the fuel farm? What makes it imperative that we do it now and do it in that amount?
I think I would call on someone from the transportation department to answer that. Erica.
Hi. So thank you very much. The reason why it is imperative that we do this quickly is because we have been given some notices by the state about the fuel farm and the practices and so forth. And so we have been attempting to be responsive to those needs that have identified potential environmental risk, as well as trying to get ourselves into a best practice place where the environmental impacts of fueling are mitigated. And the amount that is involved is based on essentially just what it costs to actually to change over from an underground fuel farm to an above ground one that is safer for the community, safer for our water sources, and more effective and efficient and modern.
Because I mean, in terms of deductions from fund balances, that is more than 4 times the amount of any other deduction from fund balance. So it just struck me as rather large.
It is, and sadly, that is what it costs.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Mary.
I move to introduce an order published by title only, Ordinance 8488, approving supplemental appropriations to the 2021 budget.
Second.
Awesome. We have a motion and a second. Mary, would you like to speak to your motion?
I think we asked all our questions and made all our comments in August, and I totally support these appropriations.
So do we have a public hearing?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, we do. I am sorry
get you
for that. Yeah. All right. So we have a motion and a second, but we will suspend discussion while we go to the public hearing. And if the public hearing changes your mind, Mary, you can withdraw your motion. So with that, give me a second and I will pull things up. Yes, let's go to the public hearing. And we have two folks signed up for the public hearing. We have Lynn Siegel and Edward Smutney. And because we're less than 15 people, there'll be 3 minutes each. So Lynn, you are up and you have 3 minutes.
Yeah, I'd like to see some of this for the side of my house, which is melting. It's basically made of particle board and lousy drainage on the gutters that drained into the house and just decomposed the siding. It'd be nice to have some shelter at my place instead of like the siding falling off to the tie down to the Tyvek and eventually down to the frame and into my house. And you know, it'd be nice to have some warmth in the winter and some cooling in the summer. I have an air conditioner, but I won't use it, of course, Sam. You know, I'm very energy efficient. And it'd be nice to have a public electric utility for Boulder that I could justify getting solar panels for so that I could get air-to-air mini splits so I can keep myself warm in the winter and cool in the summer. I'm 68 years old. It'd be nice to have a little bit of at least basic, you know, basic needs met. That'd be nice. That'd be nice for some of these funds. That's it. Bye.
All right. Thank you, Lynn. And I've been told by Ryan that the next speaker is not here. So with that, we will bring the public hearing to a close and come back to council. We have a motion and a second. And Mary, did you want to finish speaking to your motion?
I just wanted to comment to Lynn that there may be some assistance for home repair available, and so would encourage her to look into that. But yes, no other comments on my motion.
Super. All right. With that, we have a motion and a second. Any other discussion? Seeing none. It sounds like, is this a show of hands, Alicia? Is that right?
Yes, sir, it is.
Okay, very good. So we will go opposite that. Does anyone want to vote against the motion? Great. Seeing none, the motion passes 8-0.
All right. All right. Thank you. Our next public hearing, item 5B, is the discussion and input on the proposed 2022 policy statement on regional, state, and federal issues.
Thanks so much, Alicia. And for that, we have,
I believe it's you again.
Thank you, Mayor. We've got Cara Castillo in the wings to walk us through it.
Okay, thank you, Nuria. Thank you, Mayor, members of council. So we have a PowerPoint presentation. If that could be started, that would be great. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so for purposes of this item, I'd like to talk about the proposed changes to the policy statement on state, regional, and federal issues. Talk about the policy priorities. Talk about more generally about the city's legislative advocacy work. We're going to have our lobbyists come up and speak a little bit about what to expect in 2022. Take some questions from council, have a public hearing, and then we'd love to receive council's direction on what kind of revisions they'd like to make. Next slide, please. So this is something that most of you know, but the purpose of the policy statement is to direct the, I'm sorry, I'm a little distracted because I'm getting some messages and I'm having a hard time. If you give me 1 second, it might be useful to turn this off because they're coming on fast and furious. Okay, I'll do my best. Apologies if you hear some messages. We'll have to move forward on that. The purpose of the policy statement is to make sure that the city officials have the direction they need to respond to opportunities as they're presented on the policy sphere on the regional, state, and federal level. Right now we have 69 positions that have been proposed for you. We have 27 of those positions that have some changes that have been proposed. Not going to be walking through all of those because they were reviewed by the Intergovernmental Affairs Committee. So your committee, composed of Mayor Weaver, Councilmember Brockett, Joseph, and Wallach. So they made some recommendations on some changes, and those changes were incorporated into an attachment A and attachment B. Attachment A is the actual changes to the policy statement. Attachment B is a summary of those changes. If you could please refer to those rather than the ones that you received in your packet, that would be appreciated. Next slide, please. So since I'm not walking through the changes, I'd like to at least kind of globally explain the kinds of changes that occurred. Primarily, they have to do with reflecting a change in circumstances because legislation or other policy or agency action occurred. At least 18 of the policy positions are changed because of that. The second category is because there's new needs that we have identified and opportunities. So there's 7 changes to policy positions that are made because of that. And finally, there's 2 positions that are made. They're just changes in existing positions that were recommended by the Intergovernmental Affairs Committee. Next slide, please. I'd like to start by summarizing some requests that Councilmember Friend made. And I want to say that I really appreciate her reaching out to me. It's always useful because, as you can see, she provided some concerns, and I actually have some proposed language, so we don't have to wordsmith on the fly. Our first concern was the fact that, of course, we know the Supreme Court is reviewing the Texas law on abortion rights. And because of that, there may very well be a need for our own state to act to make sure that we protect women's reproductive freedoms. So she asked if it was appropriate to add it here. If you agree that it is appropriate, I have language as written and read on this. Plain and simple, protect women's reproductive freedoms, including their right to access abortions. This could also be something that is eventually addressed at the federal level in terms of legislation, or perhaps we might be asked to sign on to an amicus brief. So a position like this would allow the city to be prepared to weigh in at all those levels. Second of all, their position number 33 has to do with protecting governmental immunity. To clarify that it's, actually, back up. So Councilmember Friend wanted to make sure that that position was not interpreted to mean that we were against, that we were supporting rolling back qualified immunity. As you know, that was established in the Major Law Enforcement Integrity Act that was passed in 2020. So the proposed change to the language that I am making to clarify that we are not proposing to roll back the changes that the state made on qualified immunity is written there. Again, it's the red language. It's qualifying an existing statement that says that the city will support legislation that provides immunity. It accepts established state law on a qualified immunity. Next slide, please. So the numbering is wrong here, but a third request that Councilmember Friend made was she felt that the position number 39, which has to do with providing minimum requirements that local governments must meet to combat homelessness, she felt that there was some language that created some equivocation. And so the language is right there, right below it in my proposal. And frankly, it's merely striking the word some And so it would read, furthermore, the city may also support minimum requirements that local governments must meet to combat homelessness. The reason we kept the word may is because we would need to look at the language before we're going to allow a state mandate that, it might apply to us, it might force us to change our own policy. We would, of course, want.
Carl, I'm sorry to interrupt. We're losing your voice. If you could pull your mic down a little bit.
Yeah, is that any better?
Much better. Thank you.
Okay, apologies about that. So her last her last question was about position number 50, which is regarding THC. So this has to do with the concerns that we have about the impact on our youth with some high potency THC, such as products known as shatter and wax. And I had proposed to strike this language because there was a legislation that was introduced, HB 21-1317, that did pass, that did address issues of packaging and the amounts and product messaging and marketing. So in my eagerness to remove positions where the legislation has passed, I did propose deleting it, but the council member friend did point out that part of the bill did charge the Colorado School of Public Health with identifying gaps in those regulations. So there might be additional legislation that's necessary. So what I'm proposing in response to her concern is to restore position 50 to read as it exists, and that is written there in red. Next slide, please. We also received, I've received directly an email response from Laurel Herndon, who you might have heard from before, from the Immigrant Legal Center of Boulder County. She's been a real champion of immigrant rights and a great partner with the city on our policy advocacy. She pointed out that Senate Bill 21-199, which repealed a lot of the anti-immigrant legislation that was passed in 2005, did not, actually in its final form, although it initially did not in its final form repeal the need for what's called the Secure and Verifiable Identity Document Act, which essentially prohibits local governments from accepting all but the most formal forms of identification, which limits our ability to take alternative forms of identification that can be useful for a variety of reasons. So what I am proposing is to return a position that was actually in our policy statement 2 years ago that was limited to just this issue. I won't read the entire thing, of course, but the main position is to repeal the Secure and Verifiable Identity Document Act, which prohibits municipalities from determining which forms of identification to accept in the provision of purely municipal services. Next slide, please. And the final request that I saw from the community, you all received emails from Leslie Glustrom and from Duncan Gilchrist from 350 Colorado. He was proposing rejecting the redactions to position number 12 regarding oil and gas. So his concern, as was Leslie's concern, is that the language may be read as to suggest that things are all fine and dandy at the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission and they can handle the rules. That wasn't the intent. The intent was to, frankly, recognize that a lot of things have changed since we drafted the initial position, and that there was quite a bit of detail there that was not necessarily accurate because of the changes that have occurred at the regulatory level. Because we don't have any subject matters experts on this issue, and because we rely primarily on Boulder County and places like the city of Longmont, who are very directly impacted by oil and gas activity, we weren't able to have somebody on our staff to provide us a kind of a point-by-point change to make to the language. So instead, my proposal was to really simplify it and to really focus on this new issue, which is the fact that there's going to be greenhouse gas emission regulations that are imposed on the oil and gas sector. One point that was brought up was a plain out mistake, which the language reads, refers to the adoption of this rule on greenhouse gas by the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, the COGCC. It should read the Air Quality Control Commission. So that is my proposal, is to revise position number 12 as it's been presented to you to make that limited change. If you would like to instead go along the approach that were proposed by these members of the community, we can certainly restore position number 12 to read as it was originally written. The danger there, again, is that we're not quite sure that it's the exact, very complex rules that are, many rules that have been adopted or are underway. We don't know whether it's still accurate. But certainly one option would be to restore the language that was originally there with this additional language that has to do with the greenhouse gas emission standards. So hopefully that's not too confusing. Next slide, please. So that's the end of the changes on the actual policy statement positions. So what I want to focus on now is the state and federal policy priorities. And as a reminder, the priorities are areas where the city anticipates prioritizing its advocacy efforts. I underline anticipates because, of course, things change and we are not able to set the agenda. And as was the case last year, there was many bills that we spent a lot of time on that were not identified as council priorities. But nonetheless, we like to be proactive, and that's the purpose of identifying these priorities. They do address legislative and non-legislative matters. The third bullet here does describe some examples of council's priorities in 2021 that were successfully met. So for example, the removal or the increase of the 120% cap on net metered residential renewable energy generation that Senator Fenberg helped us achieve, along with other very important elements to the bill. Of course, at the federal level, we received some tremendous pandemic fiscal support in terms in the form of the CARES Act and the American Recovery Act. For 2022, we're proposing 5 state policy priorities and 4 federal policy priorities. So if we can go to the next slide, we'll begin reviewing those. So the first one has to do with mental and behavioral health. What we're hearing from our mental behavioral health professionals is that our community is under a significant amount of strain that's been placed on us because of the pandemic, because of the King Super shooting, and that this has really translated into an increase in stress, anxiety, suicide ideation, and the other things that are described here. And they are requesting that we engage the state in increasing the amount of resources and services and to reduce the barriers to mental and behavioral health care. I've listed there a few examples of the kind of support that we would ask from the state. Much of this is done at the local level. It's actually primarily something that the county and nonprofit providers are the lead. However, the city of Boulder, as you know, is very much involved in either just financing some of these efforts or actually in the case of the crisis intervention response team, it's a program that we have ourselves. So it's very much a complementary effort. We'd like to engage the state as much as we can. We've already met with Representative Mobley, who is actually a real champion for this issue, is involved in a lot of decisions that will be made during the interim session on how state funding can be used. So we are hoping to meet with her. Actually, we have a meeting scheduled with her and the rest of our delegation so that our police chief and our housing and human services director can go into a little bit more detail on the challenges we have with substance abuse and explore how we might be able to partner with the state. So that's what this first priority is about. Next slide, please. The second priority is around ranked choice voting. You all know that Boulder, by charter, is now required to elect its mayor by using ranked choice voting in 2023. We were successful this last session in passing legislation that will allow just that, the coordination of IRV between cities and counties. However, let me back up here. The Secretary of State's office needs to take various actions to make that happen, including some minimum system requirements and specifications for voting systems. The fiscal note for doing that is just over $600,000. And they do not have that funding. While they received the authorization to do this through HB 21-1071, they have not received the funding. So that is our policy priority number 2 is to make sure that the office receives the funding they need. We are hoping that the Secretary of State's office will make a request for this funding through their general fund request to the governor's office. In fact, Mayor Weaver and I have a meeting with the Secretary of State next Monday to discuss this very matter. Next slide, please. The third priority has to do with, as part of the overall effort to reduce greenhouse gases in all the sectors of our economy. There has been proposed a greenhouse gas pollution standards for the transportation sector. It's part of a greater effort to remove funding from I guess mobile sources, you would say. A lot of the reduction will occur through the switch to electric vehicles over time. So 8 metric meter ton CO2 equivalent is what's anticipated through that transition alone. However, there's still about 4.7 metric meter tons that will need to be reduced through other means. And one of those means that's being proposed to do so is to take advantage of the state and regional transportation planning process. So CDOT and the various MPOs throughout the state, 5 of them, including our own Dr. Cog, the Denver Regional Council of Governments, approve transportation plans. And that basically decides where state and federal funding goes. And it's obviously impacts a lot of things, including land use. And so this proposed standard would create budgets for each region of the state for CO2 equivalent emissions budgets. And it would require these plans to comply, to essentially demonstrate through modeling that the projects that are being added to the plans cumulatively, collectively, would not result in emissions greater than the emissions budgets that are being provided for each one of them. This is a highly complex, controversial issue because it does have impacts on encouraging VMT reduction, which really has the impact of encouraging communities that have the land use to support kind of alternative modes of transportation, such as transit and walking and biking and things like that. So it kind of intrudes into the area, or I should say it does. It is perceived to be a challenge for a lot of communities that feel like they should be able to make these decisions on their own and not have the state and federal purse, preventing them from making decisions on how to grow their city or county. However, we have an opportunity to really make a difference. The city of Boulder, of course, we can reach out to CDOT, but we sit on many different tables where these decisions are going to be considered, including starting with Dr. Cog. Councilmember Brockett is our representative there, and they will be taking a position on it. Our Climate Coalition will be taking a position on it and has already begun providing some comments. The Metro Mayors Caucus, the Northwest Mayors and Commissioners Coalition, the Colorado Municipal League. So this is really an example of our policy priorities and our policy statement positions in general are not just having the city try to go straight to the source, but working with our various partners to make a difference. And so the proposal here is to support the adoption of this rule. I will say that we expect, and we actually would like probably to see quite a bit of an evolution and revisions in the rule. So what we're proposing is to adopt support for the rule conceptually in terms of making sure that emission reductions occur tied to transportation plans, but we know that things such as the modeling, some of the mechanics, some of the enforcement mechanisms, waivers that may be issued, those things are going to have to be revisited, and we'd like to be part of the discussion. Next slide, please. So this fourth policy priority has to do with building energy codes. So again, different sector of the economy, the residential, commercial, and industrial sector, they, according to the governor's roadmap for reduction of greenhouse gases, need to reduce their emissions by 4.7 metric million tons of CO2 equivalent by 2030. And one of the ways that is being proposed, and actually the actual roadmap proposed to get there, is to require advanced building codes. And it would, so what is being considered now? I know that at least right now, one high-level official in the government is considering a requirement for local governments to adopt such advanced codes as a floor. Local governments would still have the ability to have a higher and more stringent regulations in terms of building energy codes, but the state would establish a floor. We believe that this is in furtherance of the city's goals to promote climate goals, specifically increasing energy efficiency and the beneficial electrification of buildings. We think that local government support will be critical. There will be quite a few local governments that I imagine will be adamantly opposed to this. In fact, that's where the main opposition will come. So it'll be important, again, with working with some of the same partners I mentioned before for Boulder, if council agrees, to take a position in support of this proposal that we expect to come forward. Next slide, please. So the fifth and last priority has to do with air pollution, something that I know we're all thinking about, and it was actually not really in our policy statement. So the Intergovernmental Affairs Committee and our Climate Initiatives Department brought this to my attention. And so there's actually been, I have a description there how it's essentially threatens public health and everything that you know. I guess it's worth pointing out that those that are most vulnerable are, and by that I mean those who don't have the option to go into an air-conditioned house or perhaps even to go into any house, are particularly vulnerable. So this is a real challenge, both in terms of the need to reduce the contributors to air pollution. So I would, so that's one position. That's position number 40 that we're proposing, as well as recognizing that we're going to have bad air. We have bad air right now. And while we have it as part of a climate resilience effort, we need to make sure that we're doing everything we can, and the state is helping us do what we can to build resilience, to help our community, to know when, as much as the best we can, when air pollution is going to be bad, to identify resources that we can use to help community members to get through these difficult times in a healthy way. Next slide. Shifting over to the federal policy priorities, the first one has to do with congressionally directed spending requests. Another way of saying earmarking. It's back after many years. The federal government is again listing recipients in appropriation bills of funding. And it's changed from how it's done before. It actually has a greater transparency. It's limited to who can get it. Local governments are on the list of who can get some of these appropriations. We as a city, this is something that we haven't spoken with council about this year or even last year because it wasn't a thing. But earlier this year, opportunities became available, and we did make a request for expanding our crisis intervention response team. This is where we have behavioral professionals going to places where police are called, but where arresting somebody and taking them to the jail may not be necessary, may not be the best for the community or certainly for the person who would be arrested. So the proposal that we've made, and we've actually gotten the support from Senator Hickenlooper and Senator Bennett. They have both submitted this for inclusion in the appropriations, in the appropriate appropriations bill, is for $245,000 for expansion of the program, which would increase the number of trained officers. It would add overtime so that officers could be dedicated to ride along with these mental and behavioral health specialists. It would add a case manager, and perhaps most importantly, it would implement a formal program to evaluate what works so that when we seek to make further changes and expansions, we're doing so in a very scientific way that has results at the front of our considerations. So this request really has to do, I give that all as background, but this federal policy priority number one is essentially saying, let's support the city supporting congressionally directed spending requests for fiscal year 2023. So those requests will be made in the spring or actually late winter of 2022. So we'll have to start identifying those this fall. I don't have any projects to bring it to you at this point, but I would like to have council's support for the city to seek these funding requests. And we would of course bring them to the council's attention immediately afterwards. Next slide, please. The second request, the federal policy priority request, is around urban forestry. This is an issue that you probably are hearing from the Climate Initiatives Department. You probably are going to be hearing a lot more from them on this very topic. They are working on it. Brett Kern, in particular, is leading an effort at the regional and at the national level to encourage funding and resources to plant trees and to create urban forests. It's seen as one of the most impactful ways that local governments can address the extreme heat that we are facing and that we expect to receive more and more. It also it also sequesters CO2, increases the absorption of stormwater. Interestingly, it's not just a question of keeping things cool. And by the way, I just read that it can reduce the temperature of an urban environment by about 10 degrees when you have the appropriate urban forest. So if you just have cement, you could very likely have 10 degrees warmer. So definitely enough to make a difference, especially for those who are getting ill or even dying because of the extreme heat. It also helps prevent cold. Our buildings don't get as cold when there's trees along the side of it. So, I guess finally, it would allow the creation of many jobs where they're most needed to actually plant these trees and maintain them and do all that it takes to have a proper urban forest. So the request that we have already begun to communicate, and actually the mayor and Brett and I have met with Congressman Goose on this very issue, is to provide significant new funding to expand urban forestry as a climate mitigation, resilience, and equity-based community development strategy, and specifically to find a segment of that money to be used for research. So we want to make sure, like I spoke about in the previous priority, is that we're using the best species and the best planting techniques, and with the investment that the federal government is likely to make, and we do expect this to occur in one of the two infrastructure bills that are under consideration, probably the reconciliation package, is that some research be done, and that some research be done in Colorado, where we have some of the best minds on this issue. Next slide, please. The third proposal is a brown multimodal improvements for State Highway 119. There is a lot of traffic, you all know, on this road, specifically the portion of Colorado 119 that goes between Boulder and Longmont, and it's expected to get much worse. And just like we did on US 36, we're working on a proposal to add a managed lane that would be used for HOV, or bus rapid transit, and a corridor-wide bikeway. So that is the third proposal. Next slide, please. So this priority has to do with Northwest Rail. As you all know, of course, this is a project that was part of the Fast Tracks measure that was passed in 2004. RTD has not delivered on it. There's reasons for it, but at this point, up until now, it's been looking very, very unlikely that we would ever get it. However, there's been a lot of hope. I've spoken to you about this before. Amtrak is promoting their front range passenger rail from Fort Collins to Pueblo. And there's interest, there's quite a bit of interest in using the Northwest Rail alignment to make sure that that front range passenger rail goes through Boulder and Longmont before it gets to Fort Collins. The State House just passed a taxing district that would allow revenue to be raised for purposes of the front range passenger rail. Again, in the infrastructure packages that are under consideration, there is already, we expect there to be more federal funding to be made available for railroads. So prospects are increased, and because of that, and because it's very important to our community, the proposal is to support the funding, construction, and operation of the Northwest Rail Line and the Front Range Passenger Rail Line as a means towards building it. Next slide. Okay, so final thoughts. I wanted to speak to you a little bit about how the city engages in advocacy. So as you know, we do our best to make sure that we are always representing what the city council wants. We are never doing what just a department director or even Nuria, certainly not myself, wants. We want to make sure that our advocacy efforts are reflective of council's will. We want to make sure that it's coordinated and uniform. And we have been very successful in my time, I believe, as a city in doing that. And because of that, when we reach out to a legislator, they recognize that, you know, this message is coming on behalf of Boulder, and they're not going to hear a different message from a different official. So this is an effort that we're always striving to improve, certainly at the staff level. But I wanted to just check in. It's kind of a sensitive issue. This is more about council's role. This is something I spoke about with the Intergovernmental Affairs Committee, and they agreed that it should be brought to the full council. The request is in full recognition that all of you are elected officials who, of course, have your First Amendment rights to speak on legislative issues or any policy issues as you would and as you would like, to just recognize that it is certainly preferable and something that I would recommend that for the sake of being effective, that we try to always coordinate our message, always keep it uniform, have it be reflective of the policy statement positions and the priorities. And if there's any question, that we revise that policy statement, we bring it back to council, or we don't take a position at all, which is always a possibility. So that's my request. Take it for what you'd like. It's nothing more than that. With that, I wanted to turn it over very briefly to our two state lobbyists to speak briefly about what to expect in 2022 at the State House. Primarily, this is an opportunity for you to see the both of them, be reminded that these are the professionals that the city hires and that are really making the difference on the ground at the Capitol. So if Will and Adam are available, if you could chime in, and I will pause there.
Great. Thanks, Carl. Will.
Yeah, I think I'm here too.
Great. Nice to see you all. Thanks for letting us join you briefly. Will and I wanted to just speak very quickly about what to expect in 2022. And I'm going to open by saying we really don't know exactly what to expect in 2022. It's early. Things are moving around. But what we do know is there are going to be certain themes that are really going to impact what's happening at the legislature. I want to talk about a couple, and then Will's going to talk about a couple as well. I think just as a reminder, one of the reasons we really don't know what's going to be happening is because every legislator gets 5 bills and every bill gets a vote. And it's something that we always say to our clients and our friends and anybody who works in politics, because it's not what you expect, right? It's different than almost every other state in the nation. It's different than Congress. A legislator introduces a bill and it gets a hearing. So it empowers minority voices, and it empowers the minority voices even within the majority caucus. So even though we might prognosticate all the different things that come, there'll be 600 pieces of legislation introduced. So it will be a lot. The other thing to think about as we go into the session is that we are right now in the midst of a major redistricting and reapportionment conversation. There are likely to be legislators who are drawn into the same districts when we're all done. And some of those legislators will announce that they are not going to run for re-election. So there will be a whole bunch, potentially a whole bunch, it could be 2, it could be 10 of legislators who are lame ducks. The last time this happened 10 years ago, in the midst of Republican control, we were able to move civil unions on the floor of the State House because there were several Republican legislators who didn't have were not afraid to vote their conscience because they weren't worried about their constituents at that point and re-election and a challenge from the right. So redistricting and an election year and 5 bills makes things very interesting as we go in. Will, you want to jump in on the things we do know that are going to influence the session?
Yeah, the one other, hello everyone, it's nice to see all of you. I wish that we were there in person. The other big dynamic that will happen this year is that we are projected to hit our Tabor spending limits for the first time in a long time. And I actually was having lunch with a member of the JBC earlier this week and we were talking about it. Obviously, we will have multiple budget forecasts and could have some change between now and the time the budget is finalized in March or April. But it could be $1 billion over the Tabor limit. And that will very much be in and of itself a big political football and debate about exactly what form the Tabor rebates take. It will also shape the budgeting process itself, because even though there's a limit now on what the state can actually spend and some requirements to send money back to voters, you're still going to have increases in caseloads and increases in all kinds of needs for spending from the state government. So it will be a very defining thing. But you also are all very aware of the large amounts of federal dollars that have come into the state. And the legislature is going to have a significant say in the spending of many hundreds of millions of dollars. And there currently are, I'll mention 3 significant kind of interim committee processes that are happening right now. One on behavioral health, one on housing, and then a whole conversation generally about economic recovery. The Economic Recovery Committee is talking about a pot of money that's about $700 million, and each of the other 2 are about $500 million. It's obviously generally all one-time money, but these are discussions with quantities of dollars that are out of the scope of normal for Colorado. I think for many of you who have been involved in the public policy debates at the state level, you know that we end up fighting in bills over $50,000, and now we're having big public debates over more than $1 billion going into this year. So I think maybe we'll probably stop there. It will obviously be a very busy year, and we're looking forward to hopefully representing you all again at the state capitol on a whole host of things that come.
Thank you, Will and Adam. Much appreciated. So that is the end of our presentation. And I guess I will always, at this point, be eager to answer any questions that you have. And of course, to defer to the committee members who have actually had an opportunity to hear not only from me, but on the experts on many of these topics. We met last week, and we had people who really knew what they were talking about, get into details and provide PowerPoint presentations of their own. So if they have anything else to say at this point that perhaps is a correction to what I've said, I would encourage them to do that as well.
Cool. So thank you so much, Carl and Adam and Will. As always, great to see you guys. It is unfortunate we're not in person, but at least you didn't have to make the trek up to Boulder from Denver. So upsides if you can find them. So let's start with questions, and let's save most comments until after we do the public hearing. It will be short. So let's begin. Any questions for Carl or our lobbyists? I see Mark and then Rachel and then Mary. Mark.
My question is for Adam and Will. In one section of our policy statement, we state that the city will support being granted the authority to place limits on the rent increases that can be imposed on pad rents in manufactured home communities. Is there any legislative support for that goal that you can discern?
Actually, Councilmember Wallach, I know you addressed that to Will and Adam, but I just had a meeting with a newly elected representative in Fort Collins who is looking to propose a bill that addresses that very issue. So I do know that there is another coalition that would like to just repeal the prohibition on rent control more generally. And they often see a more limited repeal that applies just to the manufactured housing industry as a challenge, as a threat, for that matter. So, yeah, so we would certainly support it. Both of those are indicated in our policy statement. It's a matter of strategy in terms of how to be most successful.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And then we've got Rachel and then Mary.
Mine's for Carl. You mentioned that the subcommittee talked about wanting council members to sort of collaborate or communicate with you before testifying at the state, if I heard that correctly. I guess right there. Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah, you sure did.
Okay, and we did some of that last year. So I just want to know, were we doing something wrong last year? Are we supposed to change kind of what we were doing? Is this a slap on the wrist? Or is this like a do that?
That would be pretty bad idea if I was trying to slap the wrist of any council member. I would say that there were some times in this last session where there were different messages being provided, and it was quite understandable. We were dealing with some issues that were at the heart of concerns here in Boulder, and frankly, we hadn't spoken about this. So that's why I think it's important going forward to have that conversation and have the agreement. If you guys agree, let's decide as a council. And of course, it would just be a strong suggestion at most, because I know that nobody would want to be completely bound to the council approved position.
Got it. And then I guess part two of that is, does that apply at all to staff as well? Because we saw some of that last year as well. So did you all talk about that?
Yep. We spoke about that for the very same reasons. I think that some of these issues were so contentious and very challenging for a lot of our leaders in the organization. We spoke about the importance. In fact, we just had a meeting with our leadership team last week where we reiterated the importance of keeping it uniform, keeping it coordinated. So something that we will strive to do better.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, Mary.
Thanks, Sam. Carl, on the state and federal priorities, is there any reason why homelessness isn't included in either one of those sets of priorities?
So it's not, it's a great point, because that is one of the most important issues that we're wrestling with. The mental behavioral health position really is a way to address a lot of that. We know that many of the people experiencing housing are suffering from mental and behavioral health issues. So that was our thinking. It was very much as an approach to address and support our homeless population, as well as many others in our community. So we didn't call out because it wasn't limited to people who are experiencing homelessness, but it certainly includes, and that was at the top of our mind.
So, I was wondering if that was the case, in which case housing is part of the solution for homelessness. Was there any thought given to adding something to that effect within the housing and human services portion of the priorities?
Yes, and I will try not to distract myself by pulling up the actual policy statement right now, but I believe we have, as one example of a support that we like to get from the state, is resources for permanent, or I should say, for housing, for people in terms of treatment, as well as for, I'm perhaps speaking beyond what I know, but I believe that our position does address the need for housing as part of the solution. And if it doesn't do so sufficiently, we can certainly add more to it.
Okay, thank you. And then kind of similarly along those lines, I believe sometime in March, May timeframe, council approved participation in the MDHI, Metro Denver Homeless Initiative. And that was not included in the list of partners and policy agendas. Is there any reason for that?
No, not at all. I think we've seen that as part of the Metro Mayor's Caucus. I believe it's a project of the Metro Mayor's Caucus, or certainly funding is because I've constantly seen the request for the annual contributions towards that going through the Metro Mayor's Caucus. So that's why I didn't specifically mention it, but we can certainly do so if you find an area to do so.
Okay, great. And then my next question has to do with the section in section 13, which is build community resilience. And would it be possible to add the concepts behind resiliency for all? It was a project that Resiliency for All was a project that was worked on by one of our new county commissioners, Martha Lochamin. And Longmont has incorporated it into as a program within their city. And I was just wondering if we might be able to incorporate some of those principles within this section. And I can send you the link to Longmont's page on that.
Yeah, so absolutely. Great suggestion. So one thing we could do, for example, is the prefatory statement or sentence before the actual examples of the kinds of things we'd like to see. We could certainly introduce that concept there or include reference to that concept. Thanks for bringing that to my attention. And please do send that to me.
Okay, will do. And then my next question, in the policy statement number 28, that talks about policies that address and begin to dismantle institutional and systemic racism. Would it be possible to add, along with housing and wealth access, to add education and access to capital?
Yes.
Thank you. And
Mary,
yes.
Just to clarify, you say education and access to capital. Is that education about capital or education about wealth management?
No, education, comma.
Okay, thank you.
Access, access to loans and finance and stuff like that.
Sure.
Yeah.
But you mean equity in education itself?
Well, access. Yes. So equity and access. Because we're talking about access in there. Let me just look at what the statement says again. So what I was envisioning was include but are not limited to health equity, housing and wealth access.
Okay, I see.
Yeah, and just adding, being specific. I know it says include but are not limited, but I wanted to be specific about those two items.
Awesome. I got it. Thank you.
Sure. And that's all I have. And Carl, I'll send you a link to Longmont's Resiliency for All page.
Thank you.
Junie.
I just wanted to make the comment, although I'm not looking at the document at this moment, that what Mary just read is actually not the updated version of the document, because I remember we actually discussed removing the mentioning of wealth access or access to wealth.
Junie, if you could turn your video off, that would be great. And I believe that I was looking at the document Mary was speaking to. I actually think you're correct. We removed end wealth access from the header. And what Mary was talking about adding was in one of the sentences, and it was specifically about education and access to capital. So if you want to talk more about that, please do.
No, well noted. That was my only comment, that she was speaking from a different version than the one that we updated during our meeting. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Junie. Okay, any other questions before we go to the public hearing? Great. Seeing none, we'll go to the public hearing. Let me bring the speaker list open, but I think it's super short again. Okay, and we have two people signed up, Lynn Siegel and Edward Smutney. And because there's two, we will have 3 minutes each. Lynn, you are up when you are ready, and you'll have 3 minutes to talk about our legislative agenda.
So far as policy, I think what needs to be done most is wealth equity. And I mean, it's stating the obvious, just like, oh, housing the unhoused. It's like, duh, yeah. But it's like, where is the money coming from? And all the money that's going into all the projects that you as the council are approving every day, like at 311, and then they drop their affordable housing and you approve them because of their affordable housing. Gone, poof, disappeared. There has to be something in this situation that binds people to their promises, that stops the excess in Boulder. I just watched one of the boards this week at Hoshi Motors, where I take my car, except I only drive my car once a year now. But now I have to drive my car way out to East Boulder because they're turning that whole block into big high-end housing, just like right a block away at Mike's Camera, Folsom. Now, this is something that happens in Boulder, Carl, but it's something that happens everywhere too, I'm sure, because the more that the high-end housing is able to be put in, the more you're digging a hole of lower end housing demand. And that's just the way it goes. And something's got to be done. My daughter lives in controlled rent in Oakland, and I can see the controlled rent side of things. But there's got to be some control too. When city council is approving all of these projects, like the sky's the limit. Up at 311, they're going to charge $50,000 a month or whatever they want to charge. They can charge anything. The biggest billionaires can be living in there and dragging our town down meantime. And there's got to be something in your advocacy, Carl, that will stop this excess, because it's bringing the whole economy down. And along with COVID, that's it. It's like curtains. We can't have an equitable situation. And of course, so many people falling off into the homelessness, and then the demand for drugs, rehabilitation, mental, and everything that you brought up. It's like a black hole, and it's a circular process, but it has to start at the top. Something has to be done about the uber wealthy folks that are pushing things like CU South.
Thank you, Lynn. And it appears that Edward Smutney is not with us. Ryan's shaking his head still. So with that, we will bring the public hearing to a close and bring it back to council. I have a few short comments. One of them is an attempt to bring us to a resolution on one of the items. So the one on oil and gas, Carl, I was thinking, I think I like everything that we've added as far as the narrative goes. I think that's super helpful and informative. I would like to see a few of the sections brought back, however. And so I appreciate the comment that we got from the public on that, and I'm pulling up the attachment, but I think it's the first three. There's the three items in section 12 that were stricken, but I would propose that we bring back. I'm sorry, I'm having to get there. There we go. The three that I think it would be good to continue carrying forward would be the applicability of federal laws section, the water quality section, and the air quality section. And I get your point that you made and agree with it, that there could be a few items in there that are a bit dated if the COGCC has made some progress on them, like with setbacks. But I think that general direction of all three of those is still something that this council would support. I think removing the last four, impact mitigation, orphan wells, standing before COGCC, and local consent, I think all of those seem very dated and might not be things we want to carry forward. But I think the air quality, water quality, and the federal laws applicability to try and bring back the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act when it comes to oil and gas would be things that this council could support. So I wanted to put that out there as a suggested way to proceed on policy 12. And then the only other thing I had to say was I think the urban forestry thing is fantastic. You will hear a lot about direct air capture when people talk tech solutions to the climate challenge, and you'll hear carbon capture and sequestration. I'm extraordinarily skeptical of direct air capture as being scalable enough, and carbon capture and sequestration is just the fossil fuel shell game. The thing which will do the most, I think, going forward for pulling carbon out of the air is making our forests healthy everywhere. And doing so in our urban environment has all the advantages that Carl just talked about. So I think forestry, preservation of forest, and urban forestry are really effectively the most cost-effective way to do direct air capture of carbon dioxide and sequester it for long periods of time. So I really want to advocate for keeping that urban forestry piece front and center as part of the work we're doing at the federal level. So that's all I've got. And I see we got one other hand up, Aaron.
Yeah, thanks for that, Sam. If I can sort of colloquy with you on the oil and gas one, I agree with keeping those points in. That was a good one, but it seemed like a couple of the other ones might still be worth having as well. And I'm thinking of the impact mitigation and the local consent. Like local consent, say, would require the city of Boulder to give consent before a well could be drilled on open space land. And I don't think we have that power right now. I don't think that new law gave us that power. So it seems like that's still worth having in there.
I'm good with that. I appreciate both of those.
Great, thank you. So I think that's a good path forward, what you described with if we also keep those two in there as well. And I want to say that, Mary, I appreciated your recommendations in the questioning period, so thanks for those. And Rachel, I appreciated those additional items that you brought forward as well. I thought those were all really good ones. There was one I wanted to comment on, which was about access to abortion, which I think does deserve a place in our legislative agenda after that appalling Texas law was passed recently that the Supreme Court has declined to intervene on so far. But one thing, Carl, in terms of your suggested language, it calls out access for women to reproductive care. And I would like for us to have more gender inclusive language in there, because there are folks that do not identify as women that may need access to abortion care as well. So Carl, if you wouldn't mind rewording that so that it's inclusive of any gender and person, any gender identity that might need access to abortion care, I would appreciate that. That would be my proposal there. And other than that, I'd just say that appreciate all the amazing work that Will and Adam did, and Carl, and so many of our objectives got accomplished in the last session. And I've never seen the policy agenda change so much, and it's because, wow, a huge amount got accomplished. So really great to see so much progress on our priorities. Thanks.
Yeah, indeed. It was an amazing legislative session. Mary.
Oh, sorry. I was not muted, but I was not looking at Zoom. I was looking at the, I just downloaded the latest version of the marked up policy agenda so that I make sure I'm looking at the right thing. I do see what Junie is saying, that wealth access was stricken from the language, and that's, but I did want to add those additional ones in place of that. I can see why wealth access would be stricken, but I would like to see education, comma, access to capital. So I went over and looked at housing, going back to my question to Carl regarding homelessness. and looking at the housing sections, they do have all the usual LIHTC and Section 8 and things like that, and the low-income housing tax credit. All of that is in there, which I suppose would cover things like permanent supportive housing. One of the things that occurred to me was, Kurt Fernhaber has brought up numerous times the need for housing to address folks that have been addicted to methamphetamines, and that it's very difficult to find housing for those folks. So if there were something that specifically called out that type of funding for that type of housing, I'm not sure exactly what it would be called, or if it's covered within one of these categories that are listed within housing. But I just wanted to bring that up to make sure that whatever is in there right now does cover that form of housing.
Thank you, Councilmember Young. So position 30, which has to do with increasing mental and behavioral health and also substance abuse treatment. It certainly can be improved. So I would take it as direction from you to make sure that we incorporate something that has to do with the housing and the shelter that's necessary. That element was certainly intended, but as I'm reviewing it now, I'm not finding it.
Okay, great, thank you.
Okay, so I guess, Carl, the first question is, do you have a coherent set of amendments so that if we propose, if somebody moves the legislative agenda with as amended, are we all clear on what those amendments are? Do you want to call them out for us?
So you can certainly do so. I mean, typically what I do is take this as an input opportunity, and I certainly have captured everything that you've said. And then I bring it back so that you can review the language that I've used. And typically that's approved on consent. We certainly have the time. The proposal was that, earlier, a year ago, we talked about making sure that this is approved by this council so that we're not overwhelming a brand new council, but we have time. So rather than me trying to review everything that has been said, that would be my proposal.
I think that's a great proposal, is that you bring forward all the edits on consent. So how does the rest of council feel about that proposal? Okay. And so with that, Carl, do you need us to make a motion tonight or do anything, or do you plan to take the feedback you've gotten and bring it back to us, final version on consent?
I have everything that I need, and I am very appreciative of your time and for the input that I've received today. Yes, I think I understand the changes that you'd like to make, and I will bring them back to you at a date that has yet to be scheduled, but we will get that done. Okay,
that is excellent. So council, last chance at this one. I think we've given enough direction. Carl says he's got what he needs. Anything else on our policy agenda? I will say thank you again to everyone, all of council and the legislative committee, the Intergovernmental Affairs Committee, for working through all of this, and to Carl especially. This is a huge task that you have to do every year. We all have lots of opinions about all of these things, and so herding the cats to getting to a document like this that's as useful as it is super helpful. And I think, Rachel, just to close on the point that you brought up about how we manage presenting our positions going forward. I think it is most helpful when we're speaking for council, like it's a position on the legislative agenda and we're testifying or lobbying legislators, that we represent it. If it's a council position, we say it's a council position, here's where you can find it in the legislative agenda, and here's what we're saying, me on behalf of council. And if you aren't sure, if any council member is not sure or it's different than what's in the legislative agenda, that we just call it out as our own opinion. And we can still testify as a council member on any subject and say anything we want, but just to be careful not to represent it as a city position. And I think that is the main distinction, is if it's in the legislative agenda and we're speaking on behalf of the city, especially if Carl knows that we're speaking intentionally on behalf of the city, then we represent it as a city position. But if there's any uncertainty, we should just be careful to represent it as our own. Do you have something to follow up with that?
Just, I would make a pitch for, it's also super helpful, like as someone who testified a lot before getting on council as well, to be a council member. I always checked in with Carl, and he gave really good data and facts, and it was helpful. So if anybody's reluctant to do that, I would say, set your mind at ease. Like it's great to converse with Carl, and your testimony will be even better.
Okay, super. All right. Well, with that, thanks everyone. Adam, Will, enjoy the rest of your evening, and see you soon, hopefully. And we will move on to the next item. And then Alicia, what do we have next?
Next, sir, we have item number 6 on this agenda, the matters from the city manager. 6A is the update on Boulder Business Recovery Program and the exploration of downtown Boulder outdoor dining program.
Thanks so much, Sam. I know this is one that we have received a lot of input, both from you and from community and from our business partners as well. And I just want to be, Yvette is going to give us a quick little presentation on the outcome of a lot of those meetings, and know that we have additional staff who have really been thoughtful about what do we need to do right now amidst this growing pandemic. And then what do we need to do in the long term as we continue to consider what is the continuation or the long-term efforts on outdoor dining. So with that, and with great thoughts, thanks to Yvette, who tried to herd the cats, speaking of that, Sam, on our side on the topic. I'll send it over to Yvette.
Thank you, Nuria, and good evening, Council. I also want to thank all of our colleagues who are with us tonight from the various departments who are contributing to this work. And with that, Emily, if we can pull up the presentation. During the last COVID briefing, Council asked to get a little bit of a deeper dive on where we are with the Boulder Business Recovery Program, especially as the pandemic effects linger. As a reminder, this slide will look familiar. It's an overview of what Emergency Order 2020-16, and thanks Sandra, who reminded me that this has been amended so many times, there's another number associated with it, which is 2020-18, and it has been amended 5 times since being in place. Basically, what all of these things allow us to do to aid community safety and business viability. And I won't go through all of the different components here, but it includes all the efforts that allow for outdoor dining. And they really are quite different as we traverse the city, including everything from city facilitated closures to a lot of appreciation of all the landlords who are letting people bump out in front of their businesses, to some additional infrastructure, signage, curbside pop-ups, and the like. Next slide. So you asked for a little bit of information of how's it going, and we can say that obviously the program has been well received by the community. We estimate expenses right now, and I want to say these are extremely conservative and best guesses because things are quite complicated and in lots of different budgets, but direct expenses of around $52,000. And if we looked at the revenue impact currently, it's about $214,000. That number we've massaged a little bit because that number includes a figure that would have been on-street revenue, parking revenue that went to the general fund. We basically took that number, timed the number of spaces that are being used, and divided it by 3 in appreciation of the fact that we know there's been lower visitation over the last 18 months. This does not include impacts or any lost revenue other than patio leasing on the mall itself where people are bumping out, or in some of the alleys where we are not currently charging for any of that curbside use. We also know there's been lingering public health and safety concerns that continue to evolve with the pandemic, but there's been some really improved industry-wide revenue performance. There's no direct link, which we pointed out in the memo, to particular restaurants or to how that revenue is derived. But as you can see by the graph provided, it's nice to see the figure going up and some degree of recovery in our really hurting restaurant industry. We did have some key learnings, and I'm tremendously simplifying that into these 4 bullets. The concentration of permits under this program are clearly in Boulder's downtown core, where we've also received the majority of feedback. I think you heard earlier one of our public comment, which basically said the surrounding neighborhood has some considerations that warrant a little greater focus. And this was all laid out in the memo, things from noise to spillover impacts of traffic and the like. There is a seasonal difference in the experience, and we recognize that. But in case of the emergency, we did want to afford people being able to socially distance by sitting outside. And it also has impacts on access in the area, not just for people in cars, but certainly for folks who are walking or living with disabilities, for the rerouting of the hop, which has caused some rollover issues and the like. And finally, I wanted to point out one of the big learnings is everybody across the country has a different model. And even within our state, different cities are exploring different ways to do this. Licensure, use of the right of way, all up for grabs and being considered anew. Next slide. I wanted to kind of provide a little bit more context for the numbers here. Again, extremely conservative, but we know that the expenses come from infrastructure and temporary art. So we did a lot of signage around town to be, and especially in the closure areas, to wash hands and to remind people to socially distance. Staff time is conservatively estimated at around $37,000. And this is based on an average 3 years ago of an average hourly wage. This is not indicative of a particular department's actual hours, but this is everything from time in permitting, administration, inspection, licensure, and we are not actually counting all the meetings primarily called by me. So I apologize to everybody on the team. Revenue. So we got a CDOT grant, and that's awesome. Several which allowed for temporary closures. This is only a portion of that award that helped with some of the signage and the retention of some artists to help us bring people's attention and make it a little nicer in the closure areas. There was $89,000 worth of waived fees, about 4,400 of which are alcohol related, and the majority of which are in other permitting waived fees. And the majority of this is for the 106 on-street repurposed parking spaces. Just to give you some context, we actually went out and counted the parking spaces. And there are, if you don't take the garages or the ones at the Muni lot and the like, we have 962, I believe, parking spaces in the Cajun district, and about 106 are currently being used for this program. And then we divided that number by 1/3. So, and again, trying to be fair and recognizing that there has been low visitation over the 18 months, we're estimating conservatively around 132,000. In the normal year, KJED on street for general fund generates about $500,000. So we should keep that in mind for a going forward consideration. Next slide. So staff's recommendation as it relates to this primarily tied to the ongoing need to provide for people to have some space and to feel comfortable and safe eating outside is to extend the program through April 1st, 2022. This would include the continuation of things that are already in those emergency orders around hours of operation and control over amplification. The state, and Ms. Shawn will be here to answer any questions you have about that, is requiring reapplication on the temporary alcohol modifications, as well as some noticing that we can talk about. We are recommending reinspection, in large part because winter is different And we want people to be safe in these areas. And there are winter differences that we want to make sure are allowing for ADA compliance and emergency vehicle access. It's been a long time since we talked to the property owners, and we just want to make sure that there is authorization to use the frontage of their property that way. And certainly want people to attest that they have continued to have the city as named insured on their insurance policies. And we're at this point recommending through April 1st, 2022, continued waiver of city fees, not state fees, but city fees through this expansion period. Next slide. So what about the post-pandemic? Like, can we all say, post-pandemic, that would be awesome to envision. Downtown Boulder has reached out to us on August 2nd and wants to explore a post-pandemic downtown outdoor dining program, which balances the needs and interests of the businesses, property owners, and the city in supporting access, safety, vibrancy, and the achievement of all of our community goals. So we have a lot of work to do, but I'm pleased to say that that work has already begun. And they have a working committee that's been getting together, and my team has worked with them a couple of times, but it's time to get very serious about this, anticipating a post-pandemic possibility, which might come back to council and get us started in the spring of 2022. It would look at the downtown scope. In other words, where is it and for how long and how often? It would look at different options that were outlined in your memo around licensure through the state and insurance. There are different possibilities around participation cost sharing models that I think is really a lot for DBP to discuss with their members and the participating businesses. And of course, we want to remind people of the other existing options that are already available to them through other city offerings. Next slide. This is a very aggressive timeline that we have proposed that was in your memo. And if this evening we gain support from council to keep moving forward, we'll do our very best to stick to this timeline and to keep you and the community posted for when we'd be able to launch a program as early as the spring of 2022. Next slide. And so we only have two questions for council. One is, does council support the recommendation to extend the emergency order 2020-16, and thank you, Sandra, 2020-18 through April 1st, 2022? Again, subject to all applicable state and local public health guidance and alcohol-related licensure requirements. And the second question is, does council support our continued work with exploration with Downtown Boulder Partnership for a post-pandemic outdoor dining program? And with that, Emily, I think we can lower the slides, and I welcome any questions that council might have.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Yvette. And I got Bob, Rachel, and Aaron. Bob.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks, Yvette. That's very, very helpful. I had four kind of questions. I'll try to do them quickly. First, I just was trying to understand the math on the loss of parking revenue. I know that you cut it by a third. In other words, the maximum potential revenue, and then you cut it by a third. Some of that presumably accounted for, I think you said, the fact that fewer people might be coming downtown. Was another factor in reducing that the fact that some people are still paying for parking? They're just paying for parking someplace else. In other words, we didn't lose all of that revenue. Somebody, went down the street or went into a garage and they still paid for parking. Is that right?
We're not sure. I think that my colleague, my deputy, Chris Jones is on, but I would say there's not a direct link right now that can prove that all the folks that were parking on that street are parking, for, let's say, in a garage or on a surface parking lot. Right. In many instances, it's very hard to kind of correlate at this point where those people parked. I would say we are seeing some return of visitation to the garages, but it is challenging and people do continue to want to search for free parking.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like it's kind of a swag. So that's fine. I know your 1/3 was just an estimate. Second question out of four. The extension, I was just kind of curious about why it's 5 months as opposed to 6 months, because currently the program ends on October 31. And 6 months would take us to the end of October, or excuse me, end of April, which we're proposing the beginning of April. Why 5 months as opposed to 6?
I believe we had some conversation with our colleagues about changes in weather and coming back to look at infrastructure and required infrastructure. And we'd always, part of this is also, we'd always been in conversations with DBP about that time frame. But I would welcome if there's a strong opinion from one of my colleagues. Otherwise we're listening for council's thoughts on that.
I just knew that there were some discussions earlier this year, maybe even late last year, about 180-day rule, and 6 months was most that you wanted to extend, and so on and so forth. So I was kind of expecting a 6-month extension. I was just curious what the driver behind 5 months. Sounds like it's weather. Is that what you're saying?
It's a part of it. There was also at the beginning of this, and continues to be, and I appreciate Sandra and her colleagues in the city attorney's office and Michonne, there's a little challenge that we have understanding of what is allowed under the alcohol licensure in terms of timing. So some of the timing recommendations were initially based on that as well. I think we still have a lot of work to do in this area. Right now, we're really still shooting for April 1st, but welcome any other thoughts.
That's fine. Third question is, do we have to take any action? In other words, if most or all council members are kind of nodding their heads and saying that they support the staff recommendations, is that good enough for you and the city manager, or do we have to take a vote at some point in time on this?
I would think that a formal vote would come in the form of if and when, and I hope we do, get to a formal agreement with Downtown Boulder Partnership and Agreement. We would typically bring some question or a motion to council on consent to approve the city manager's authorization in that agreement. But I'm not aware of.
That's for the 5-month extension or for a longer term arrangement?
That's for a longer term arrangement.
I'm sorry, I was just talking about the 5-month extension.
No formal vote.
I can jump in there and answer that. So this is really city manager action in terms of the emergency order. So I think staff is just looking for direction from council, but it really is a city manager rule.
Thanks, Sandra. That's appreciate it. And then my fourth and final question, Yvette, is could somebody put the second to last slide up, the one with the timeline? I didn't quite track that one by pretty quickly.
That's because it's so aggressive. I didn't want you to look too close.
Well, because that one I do understand why there might be some action by council, and I didn't see an action point. I saw an IP, the one before that. Yeah, so I'm looking like in the kind of March, April timeframe, I'm kind of looking for an action by council, and I didn't see anything there.
And part of that, thank you for that. And we could certainly come back with an additional update. Right now, we have ourselves in April looking for that approval or letting you know where we stand in implementing against that spring timeline. I don't believe there's another action at that point, but frankly, there's been so much change during this COVID period. We also want to remain somewhat fluid in that. Do you have a suggestion in that regard?
Well, I guess what I wouldn't want to do is I wouldn't want to wake up on the morning of April 1st and say, oh my gosh, we needed to take an action back in February or March and we didn't, and now the trucks are out there removing the Jersey blocks and people having to clear away picnic tables. So I guess I'd put a marker out there and say, let's come back to council in February and say this is what's going to happen April 1, or at least ask the question what's going to happen April 1. I wouldn't want just there to be an IP in April, because that's the things expire by then. So I guess that's what I would say is I appreciate the fact we're having this conversation on September 9th against an October 31 deadline. That's great. I would suggest we do the same thing in February against an April 1 deadline.
Okay, thank you for that.
That's all I have.
Great. Thank you, Bob. Next, we've got Rachel and Aaron. Rachel.
Thanks, Yvette, for the information. To answer question number one, I'm generally very supportive. A couple, I guess one question. Did the emergency orders apply only to downtown, or were those citywide?
Those were citywide.
Okay, because obviously we're just looking at downtown for this. So I was wondering, and maybe I'm just misremembering, but like if we're looking at garage dooring and alleys and maintaining some of what we've had, and the Hill has benefited and it's not in the map. Like what happens? Can the Hill also benefit from some of this in the near term or other areas that might be appropriate? Or why are we only talking about downtown?
The portion of the presentation that relates to emergency orders would continue to be citywide. It's only the portion that would be post-pandemic that we're currently talking to downtown, because that's where the majority of the feedback and issues have been coming from. Nevertheless, I have been in contact with a couple of business operators on the Hill, and I can certainly reach out to the Hill Boulder if they're interested in exploring similar idea.
So I think I'd be supportive of that. I just remember a couple years ago, we talked about like the Hill wanting to activate alleys. And so when they saw alleys and I assume garage dooring, I'm embarrassed to admit, but like, is that like what the restaurants have the garage door that goes up and it converts? Okay.
Yes.
And is that not legal in the city right now?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
But there's a regular city process for that. There wouldn't need to be any emergency order, and you don't need to wait till February to start that process. Of course, I don't want to speak for Jacob and his team and their workload, but those things are possible to look at even now.
Okay, awesome. So yeah, I guess I would just say if it, and I understand this is probably coming from downtown and that's the impetus and why the focus maybe is there, but if it can help other places, I would also support that.
Thank you.
Pardon me, Aaron.
Yeah, so thanks so much for the presentation and for coming back to us quickly. I really appreciate your responsiveness and you and your team bringing this back. So thanks. And to answer your question, I'm very supportive of the direction you're going in. Thanks very much for doing this. I think it's a great idea. And just to Bob's comments around timing, I would certainly support 6 months instead of 5 months. April, as they say, is the cruelest month, right? It can be very variable in terms of its climate, its temperature. We often get snowfalls and such. So anyway, so we won't quite be to spring. And the other thing is that I wouldn't want to see this go away before we had instituted the new program. So you said it's an aggressive timeline. I appreciate you doing that. So hopefully it'll work out on that timeline. But I'd hate to see this disappear 30 days before we got a new program in place. So agree with Bob as well to bring this back to us, for a check-in, maybe in the February timeframe, something like that, so we can see how the new program is coming along in its development, which I do also support very much, and see how the timing is working out so that we can make sure and adjust the current approach and tie it neatly into whatever the new approach ends up being.
And I do, I don't know that they're on, or I'm sure they're listening tonight, but I cannot also speak for the workload at Downtown Boulder Partnership. I know we're all crazy busy and there's ambassadors and lots of things. So I also want to respect their resources and the ability to address some of this, but we'll certainly convey that. Thank you, Anne.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we have to work with our partners carefully, right? So that's it. That's all I got. Thank you again.
Good. Thanks, Aaron. Mark.
Yeah, just to clarify, Yvette, is there a state requirement that limits the licensing to April 1?
So I'm going to defer to Michonne and Sandra on the various things we are continuing to learn.
So I'll try and speak about this. And Michonne, if you're here, you can feel free to correct me if I say anything that's incorrect. But so the state imposed a communal outdoor dining regulation during the pandemic that allowed for expedited temporary modifications of licensee premises. And that was going to expire, or it is going to expire on October 31st. But there was a House bill that was introduced to basically continue the communal outdoor dining, but make it permanent. However, it's not on an expedited basis, so they have to follow all of the time frames and timelines associated with a regular temporary modification, which I generally, and this is where I'm not sure about the details, Michonne, is 30 days in advance notice. There's a 10-day posting requirement. There's an ability for it to go in front of the BLA, the Beverage Licensing Authority, instead of being process administratively. So the time frame is much longer. So that's part of the issue, is that it would require extensive time to apply for that permit, that more permanent outdoor dining permit. And I don't know what the length of the this must have been something that you Yvette, you and Michon spoke about, but there is a certain length in which they have to renew, and it may be such that it's 5 months, and I'm not familiar with that because I'd have to look it up, but I'm sure that if Michon is available, she can address that.
Yeah, I'm here. If you can hear me, I think that my video won't come on, but
we can hear you. You're good.
Yes, we checked with the agent in charge at the State Liquor Enforcement Division, and what they said is that on October 31st, temporary modifications, standard temporary modifications, are going back in place. Before, during COVID, there was expediting and fee waivers that happened on a state level. That's going away on October 31st. So the requirements for reapplication for temporary modifications is that liquor licensees need to file at least 30 days prior to the first event date. They need to pay the state fees, even if the city waives the $50 fee, they still need to pay the state fees, and the state will not be expediting those applications. In addition, the requirements in the state liquor code revert to 10-day posting. And if, as a result of the 10-day posting, there's negative comment, then we need to send it before the Beverage Licensing Authority for a hearing for that temporary modification. So all of those sort of individual steps were all expedited during COVID, and they won't be after October 31st. As far as the duration of temporary modifications, the duration is for a particular license term. So if a liquor licensee's license expires in 2 months, then they would have a 2-month-long temporary modification, and then they would further need to reapply for their next license term. So it's really individual based on how long a particular licensee has on their own liquor license. So.
And is that term at all affected by the April 1st date? In other words, are we unnecessarily putting people through an additional licensing procedure that they would not otherwise have to do by the April 1st date?
I guess I don't foresee that. I don't foresee that.
I don't either. And I think part of the challenge with this is when the state's prior process ends. And then when you start again, there's unclear guidance at this point, and I appreciate Sandra's colleagues who are helping us look into this. So at this point, we're going based on our prior understanding and in every hope that the pandemic doesn't continue to linger in this way.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it.
I also, Michon is the expert, but I also want to point out there is truly a difference between communal consumption, entertainment districts, individual licenses, all of which might be things that downtown Boulder wants to explore, but they truly are very different across all of those different options.
Yeah, and in addition to that, I would just note that the Beverage Licensing Authority has talked about communal consumption areas and common consumption areas twice, once in hearing and also at their retreat. So they're open to hearing those voices and doing that work. Thus far, they're, and it seems like that's changing, that there will be some community impetus from a group of liquor licensees, which is interested in, proceeding with that. So.
Okay, I do appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Bob.
So I guess I didn't hear anything from that just dialogue was initiated by Mark. to indicate that there's a liquor license reason for an April 1 date. And so I joined Aaron in urging that to be April 30th. As a matter of fact, the memo referred both to, I think I used the word through April, and then later it referred to April 1. So I guess I would agree with Aaron. Let's give staff and the Downtown Boulder Partnership adequate time to do this. If there's no compelling reason under the state law, liquor law, to pick April 1, then let's make this April 30th. That's a clean 6 months from our current October 31 cutoff. And I want to also agree with Rachel. I know that the temporary extension, the 5 or 6 months temporary extension, will be citywide. I do agree that there are certain parts of town, particularly on the hill, particularly on the event street on the hill, that I think could benefit from whatever the staff and Downtown Boulder Partnership comes up with downtown. So I would hope that as we think about places like the hill, particularly the event street, we think about doing whatever we do downtown there. And I'm not talking about parklets here and there around town. I'm talking about a long-term street closure like we're talking about in West Pearl. I would include the event street for that. So, and I just wanted to be clear that I do support the staff recommendation with those adjustments.
Thank you, Bob. Mary.
Thanks, Sam. Yeah, just want to thank Yvette for all the work that you've done so rapidly and responsibly. And to say that I support the direction that you're going with the revisions that my other colleagues have suggested with respect to 6 months. I just have a general question about, we're talking about the first item being all of citywide. And have there been any businesses that wanted to participate but couldn't for whatever reason? Have you seen any of that, or has everybody that wanted to participate been able to?
Not that we're aware of.
Okay, that's wonderful. Thank you. That's all I have.
Thank you, Mary. Adam.
Thanks, Sam, and thanks, Yvette. I will also say yes to both your questions, and with particular emphasis on the check-in, just because we'll have a new council and want to make sure they know what's going on. And the businesses are out ahead of it as well. And also to extending to the hill, I think from what I've heard from a couple owners up there, they've really enjoyed the ability to have some additional flexibility. So that may be part of the ongoing lifeline we want to give them just to improve the space in general.
Cool. Thank you, Adam. Mary, I see your hand up. Is this new or old? Okay, old. All right, super. Rachel.
I didn't know if maybe you were going to do a straw poll, but I'll support the extending it to the end of April too, just to get that on the record.
Great. Well, I wasn't going to do a straw poll only because it seems like we have such consistency in our response. I appreciate you, Yvette, for herding cats. This is more cat herding than usual. And so not only us, but all of the other folks involved, but it's very important work. So much appreciated. And I agree, yes, on both items. I would like to see the 6 months, so end of April. For the first part, I think looking ahead and doing something permanent around this will create kind of a progress towards that European ideal of space that can be reconfigured for different parts of the day, public space that's very dynamic and is used for lots of things, including dining. So I'm enthusiastic about all of this and moving forward with it. The only caveat that I have is let's please do take a systematic look at access and, the changed traffic patterns when we have these outdoor dining areas and so on. Because as I go back and forth between 9th and 11th on Pearl, part of it's really easy to move around in. No matter what mode you're moving in that's non-auto, but towards each end, the center parts are completely closed down. The dining areas occupy everything sidewalk to sidewalk. And with the additional foot traffic, the sidewalks aren't high capacity enough, and they become quite congested and very crowded. And especially during COVID, that's been problematic because you got people, right next to each other. So I would just ask that we, especially as we look towards making this permanent, that we make sure that we're equitable so that the restaurants are treated equitably, and that we make sure that access is a big part of it, because the mall works great because generally speaking, there's a lot of room for pedestrians to walk back and forth on. But even the mall at a few places has gotten a bit more congested than usual with the outdoor dining. So that's my only caveat, is it does create, it just needs to be equal, and there need to be rules, and the rules need to be, applied equally to all people who want to use that public space. And with that, I'll turn to Mary and then Aaron.
Yeah, thanks. I did want to bring up one additional thing with respect to safety. And I know I want to thank you for bringing up the ADA requirements, but I have a question about the at the intersection of Pearl and 9th on the east side there, where the crosswalk, the concrete barriers, the Jersey barriers are to the east of the crosswalk to leave the crosswalk outside of the common area for the restaurants. I know we had at least one accident, and one of us here is very familiar with that accident. And I'm just wondering if that has been deemed to be an area that is used for drop off and pickup by automobiles. And if there is any consideration to be given to that particular intersection to make it safer.
It is not designated for drop off and pickup. But I would always defer to our transportation and mobility team in terms of guidance with our planning department on safety and any amendments that have to be made. Thanks for that note, Mary, and we'll make sure that we take a look at that.
Yeah, I'm not sure that it's being used but for drop off and pickup, but I could see how it could be. And as somebody is pulling back out into traffic, they may be completely unaware of the fact that there is a stoplight there and not be looking out for that. So just wanted to make sure that we address that. Thank you.
And I'll just colloquy on what Mary said, and then I'll get to Aaron. I've noticed a couple times people, transportation network companies with vehicles that are stopping on Broadway to pick people up on the Pearl Street Mall. I've seen it happen in both directions on Broadway, where Uber or Lyft or other driver stops dead in the middle of Broadway at the mall, and people load and unload into the car. And I've seen it more and more. So Mary, it's similar to your point about what's happening on 9th Street. But I don't know what we need to do about that, but it is becoming, I think, an increasing problem. I've been seeing more of it. And, the 9th Street is a good example of that. I'm not sure what can be done about it exactly, but I think it's a problem in more places. It's not such a big deal on 13th and 14th because traffic is really slow and there's lots of stops. But on Broadway and 9th, it's a different animal. Aaron.
I just wanted to add in some support for what you were saying about the obstructing the entire street close to 9th on Pearl. Just I do recommend that we leave a corridor open, that we require folks to leave 3 feet or something in between the different on-street amenities, because you should be able to walk through there. So it's just one comment. Thanks.
Thank you, Aaron. Okay, I will turn to staff, Yvette and others. Did you get what you need from us?
I think so. And I, again, want to express much thanks to all the cats that are here this evening and all the cats at home. I appreciate your partnership and I look forward to working with you in these next few weeks. Thank you all.
Thank
Should
you,
have Fair
Yvette.
by here for talking with cats.
That's right. And there we go. All right. And then Alicia, what is our next item?
Our next item, sir, is item 6B, which is the city clerk's confirmation of approval from the 3 initiative petition committees to move forward with submitting their measures to the electors on the ballot at the November 2nd, 2021 municipal coordinated election.
Great. Thank you. And Nuria, over to you.
Well, I'm going to turn it right over to our wonderful city clerk to give us a quick little update on what that looks like.
All right. Well, thank you, Ms. Nuria, for both the introduction and the compliment. Yes, Council, in accordance with our charter, section 41, and I'll read it just for clarity, prior to an election being set on the initiative petition, within 10 days after the date of final action on such measure by the council, the committee of petitioners shall certify to the city clerk the requirement of submission of the measure to the voters. The certification by the committee of petitioners must be a unanimous vote of the members of the committee, legally competent to act at such time. Upon receipt of that certificate, the city clerk shall certify the fact to the council at its next meeting, and such measure shall be submitted by the council to the voters of the electors in November. So with that being said, the final action for all 3 initiative petitions was in August on the 17th at the regular meeting. So I worked with the city attorney's office and we sent out emails to all the committees and every member, because they have to, again, vote unanimously to proceed with the measure to be placed on the ballot. And we got confirmation from each of those committees unanimously. So with this particular, I say, from what I understand, is a record year of initiative petitions. This is our last step before the election to move the petitions forward. And with me reading the item into the record, that certification and that particular requirement was met.
Awesome.
So I'm open for questions if council has any.
Thank you, Alicia. Council, any questions or feedback? Great. Seeing none, thanks for dotting the I's and crossing the T's on that for us, Alicia. Much appreciated.
All right, sir. Thank you all. All right, our next item is item 8 on this agenda, matters from the mayor and members of council. 8A is the discussion regarding timing of ordinance 8485, the 2020 midterm update to the BVCP, which is scheduled for first reading on September 21st and second reading on October 5th.
Super. Thank you, Alicia. And so I brought this forward to council because Mark had brought up that he wasn't sure that it was appropriate for this council to take these rezoning actions and maybe it should go to the next council. I didn't necessarily agree, but wanted to give Mark a chance to speak to the full council, because as it is scheduled currently, we will take the final actions to complete the 2020 comp plan update as it's scheduled. And Mark, did you want to speak to your thoughts on that?
Sure. We actually have something of great consequence that we're going to be addressing on the 14th and 21st. And it seemed to me that the rezoning actions require a little more consideration than we're going to be giving it in that short time period immediately following what's going to be a very difficult and contentious process of decision making on CU South. And I'm not convinced that we can't take a look at it before this council expires, but I thought doing it hard on the heels of the decision making process for CU South was simply rushing it too much. If we pushed it back a couple of weeks, I'd feel a little more comfortable about it.
Okay. Rachel and then Mary.
Just a question. When is it scheduled for? Vote.
First reading on the 21st. We might have a
first read.
First reading on the 21st of September, second reading on October 5th.
Okay, then I just want to make sure I understand what we're talking about. Is this sort of the end point of a process that we dug into, I want to say last summer in part?
Yes.
This is, thank you, Sam. I didn't know who that was too, but I guess I will say I thought that we analyzed this pretty critically previously, and this was more of a just like putting the period on it than a maybe a more robust discussion. So maybe I don't understand what we're talking about and would appreciate clarification if this is not an extension and just a completion of something.
I'll just weigh in briefly, Rachel, that I think it is just a completing of other work that we've done. But Sandra or others, if you'd like to jump in and answer Rachel's question, I think that might be appropriate at this time.
Sam, Jacob here. I'll just
Jacob, there you go. Thanks.
Item. It's correct that this is the completion of previous actions. All of the items that are engaged here were presented to you in detail during the adoption of the midterm comp plan update in December 2020. So the rezonings here simply implement the land use plan changes that you've already approved. And these changes have already been vetted with the public through a variety of platforms, including Planning Board and Housing Advisory Board. And in effect, the action that's before you is a pro forma action and is the final procedural step in the Boulder Valley Comp Plan midterm update process. And happy to answer any further questions about process going forward.
Okay.
Just a quick question, Jacob, if I can jump in. When did we last review this material?
This material was presented to you in December of 2020.
Okay. Then I would simply say that it being 9 months, 10 months since we last looked at it, and my colleagues may have a different view. I would like, rather than to rubber stamp it, I'd like to be able to look at it one more time, and it's fairly voluminous. And I just thought the timing was not ideal.
And that's fine. Mark, if you're suggesting we move it a little bit, that's kind of a different.
That's all.
Okay. So that's how.
I'm not suggesting that a new council do this de novo and start from scratch. I'm suggesting that we just have a little more time after what's likely to be a very contentious couple of meetings to do whatever final analysis or review that we wish to do. And it may be that we don't wish to do anything. I just know that for me, I would like to take a look at the materials one more time, having not looked at them for 9 or 10 months. And astonishingly, they are not all engraved on my memory. So it was more of a procedural request than a suggestion that we kick this over to the new council.
Can I wrap up my so understanding that better? Thank you, Mark. I'm supportive. It sounds like we could maybe move it then to October 5th, so we're not digesting it on the same night as the CU South. I don't know why you think that's going to be contentious, but so that we don't do it that night and do it maybe the 5th and then the 16th or
yes, that's really all I'm suggesting.
Okay. I'm supportive of that. I'm not supportive of starting it over with a new council.
No. I think that would be a horrible thing to do. Horrible to the new council members, if nothing else.
Great. We've got Mary, Adam, and then I'll go. Mary?
Yeah, so I would support just moving it to October 5th and then October, whatever, 7 days or 14 days is after that. I just want to say that, what Jacob said about it being pro forma, believe it or not, this is like my third comp plan update that I've been through. And it is very, very pro forma process where you're basically implementing whatever changes were made or recommended through it trickles down through all the documents in the city, and so the zoning changes are basically implementing what we've already approved. So it's quite pro forma. Everything has already been vetted, and maybe, if I recall correctly, maybe the most controversial of those zoning changes is likely 3303 Broadway. And we have already been through a lot of process on that particular one. So I'm okay with moving it out, but it is just similar to what we did a couple of weeks ago with putting all of the petitions on the ballot. It's just
I'd just like the opportunity to look at it one more time, and I think that's not going to be as likely if we're doing it on the original schedule. I am not suggesting we kick the can down the road. That was really not my intent.
Super. Adam, and then I'll go, and then Bob. Adam?
If Mark wants more time to read every single letter of the packet, I would never deny him that.
Great. And I agree. I didn't want to kick it too far down the road, but it would be pretty easy for us to put first reading on the 5th and then second reading on the 19th, and then do the hearing on the 19th. Right now, the 19th is a 3.5-hour meeting. So it will go a little longer. So council, if you nod yes to Mark's suggestion, we may have a slightly longer meeting on October 19th, but it may be the last long meeting this council has. So maybe you want to savor it. Bob.
I'm fine with a slight extension as well. I was going to make a slightly different calendaring suggestion. The 28th is a special meeting, and it's a light meeting right now. Returning the 12th of October from a study session to a special meeting, that's also a light meeting. So I might suggest the 28th and the 12th would be better than the 5th and the 19th, which are both heavy meetings.
Sure. No, I like that. That's a great suggestion. Sandra, and then Junie.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that Alicia had noted that there are 4 public hearings scheduled for the 19th already. I'm just now looking at it myself. So I think that we just need to be careful about that. And then the fact that we just need to make sure that there's enough time in between first and second reading as well.
And that's great. And thank you for that input. And I'll go to Junie next, but as Nuria has mentioned, we could take this back to CAC with this input. I just wanted to make sure all of council had the chance to weigh in, and we can finalize it. But I think Bob has made a good suggestion. Junie.
Actually, that's what I was thinking as well, to have CAC look at it instead of making this durable decision tonight on a fixed schedule. So, because I also have something I wanted to bring before CAC that could potentially impact the schedule moving forward in those couple of within the next month. That's all. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Junie. So with that, I will suggest that CAC takes this up with the input. That's why I brought it here, was to get this kind of input. And I think we have enough to go on at this point. And Bob's on CAC, I am, and Junie is. So we'll take this and we will you'll see it in the CAC minutes. And if you don't like it, let us know. All right. So I think we're done with that one. Alicia, what is next?
What is next, sir, is item 8B, which is the discussion on appointments to the Council Employee Evaluation Committee.
Excellent. And I also brought this forward, but Mary has the one that motivated it. So Mary, would you like to speak to this?
Right. So Sam and I are in the current evaluation committee, and as one of the things that we were hoping to accomplish prior to COVID hitting was to realign the 3 council employee evaluation schedules to bring them into alignment with the rest of the city employees. And in order to do that, I think we need to start sooner than later. That should probably go to a new evaluation committee, because the conclusion of that process will likely not happen within this council. So we need to take a couple of volunteers, and maybe we put it out there and y'all think about it. But it's pretty narrowed down as to who can be on the evaluation committee, since there will be assuredly only 4 council members returning. Perhaps Mark will too, but for sure 4. So one of you 4, 2 of you, 2 of you's got to do this. So think about that. And if you want to volunteer, maybe we set another time to do the actual appointment, unless you already know what, if you want to do this.
So Mary, if I could just ask for clarification, we have one of our employees to do the evaluation for this year. That's Judge Cook. And
Correct.
Mary and I have been kind of focused on the city manager search and then the city attorney search part of it. And so I dropped the ball on us moving through that evaluation. Normally it would be coming to council about now to complete. And so the thinking on this was, since we need to do this, it might make sense to appoint 2 new members who will be on the evaluation committee, who need to be experienced members of council, have them work with Mary and I to do that evaluation. And then those 2 council members continue with the work that's going to happen with the realignment of schedules and into the next council. So that's the subject. Did I get that right, Mary?
Well, I don't know that they would work with you and I, because that is more than 2 council members working together. So the way I see it is, yes, you're correct. Judge Cook needs to have a review, but the suggestion from Jen was to take this opportunity to align it with the other city employees, since we're getting a new city attorney and we have a new city manager. Well, not so new anymore, but in any case, yes, we need to do the evaluation for Judge Cook and the realignment of the process. So, and for that, it really takes, it can't wait until January to appoint a new one, because the current evaluation committee will not be here through that period. So, so I'm not so sure that you and I need to work with the new evaluation committee. I think they would work with Jen.
All I meant by that was hand off whatever we needed to hand off as far as like the knowledge of how it worked. Jen can take care of most of it. I agree. I just thought you and I might want to do a handoff of some kind to the new folks. I see some hands here. Let me make sure I get them in the right order. I've got Rachel and then Aaron.
Well, I think that's an old universe hand, but I will ask a question since I'm up. Can somebody describe the amount of time that goes into this? For the 4 of us who, I do appreciate Sam's notion of passing the baton and educating people before you both leave. So that's probably would be appreciated by whoever takes this on. I would be curious to know a little bit more about what it is to take this job on.
So I can speak briefly to that. My experience, I've been on it 3 cycles now, and this last one was totally unusual. So really 2 cycles. And it gets started in, well, the old timetable. It will be a new timetable, but in the old timetable, it'd start sometime at the beginning of summer. We'd start having our meetings, and we would meet with a consultant and figure out what process we were going to use. Obviously, there's been a past process. We'd see if we wanted to make any updates. So during that 6-week period, we might meet 3 or 4 times to set up the process. And then the staff then goes out to the peer review. So it's usually been a 360 review. And so the HR staff would handle getting the reviews out and so on. So from a council member perspective, there was a quiet period that lasted about 6 weeks. And then it was time for council members to give their review. And that's where the herding cats comes in, because council members, me included, are notoriously bad at actually doing their reviews. And so then from late summer into fall, there's another half dozen meetings, which are with the subcommittee and chasing down the reviews, and then collating the review data and then getting it back to council members. So we have council members fill out the same surveys that the peers did of the 3 employees. And then we get all that information back out to council, get council's feedback on what we wanted to do as far as raise levels and so on goes, and then hand that off at a meeting. So it's about 6 months worth of work, and it comes in 2 bursts. And for a little while, it might take 4 hours a week for 3 weeks at both of those times. So that's the way I saw the time commitment. Mary, anything to add?
You have way more experience with this than I do. I only have the weirdo year experience.
So it is not insignificant, but it is, in a couple different buckets when you have the work to do.
Okay, I'll wait till Aaron goes and then chime in with a purposeful hand.
Super, Aaron.
So I think it's fine to move forward with this right now. I would just consider these interim appointments, so that sure. In the January, when we appoint the new council to all the different committees, that we just wouldn't treat these folks as incumbents, but say, who wants to do it this year?
Yeah, I'm totally fine with that. My very strong recommendation is it be experienced council people doing this, because it takes a little bit of extra work, and having some cultural background as far as how things have gone in the past through your own experience of it would be helpful, I think. But the new council can appoint whoever they want.
Sure. And I don't know about you, but in college, the way it worked is if you were the first person to put your finger on your nose, you didn't have to do a commitment. So.
Rachel.
Right, I'm back with an intentional hand now, which is Bob and I are doing the attorney recruitment right now, and it might be easy for us to just continue with Jen in this transition as interims and sort of carry on. So I would just propose that maybe it makes sense for me and Bob to do this at least on an interim. And I don't see Aaron or Judy or Bob really not touching their nose. So I'll make that proposal.
Sold.
That's great, Rich. Great. Bob, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I'm willing to do that, but I do agree with Aaron that I do think we need to, out of fairness, bring this back to the new council. I do concur with you, Sam, that some experience is necessary, but Mark, for example, may very well wish to do it. And we don't know for sure that he'll be reelected. So I think I'm happy to be appointed along with Rachel, and then we'll visit with our new colleagues in Mark in January and see what they want to do long term.
That is excellent. Rachel, did you have something else?
It would be ideal if it didn't really kick in until the end of the attorney recruitment, so we weren't trying to do everything, but and I think that's probably true for Jen as well.
Junie?
Can you hear me well enough?
Yeah, we can hear you right now. Yep.
Okay, great. I don't know what kind of experience you're referring to when you said something about culture, because I would be a senior counsel, yet I still don't know the nitty-gritty of this evaluation committee. And my hope is that these
Junie, you just went on mute. So we just lost.
Can you hear me now?
We can. You're back.
Yeah, I'm not sure what happened. But as I was saying is that I think appointing Bob and Rachel right now would actually, what's the word? It would stop the new council from throwing their name in the hat as, people who could do it. So I don't agree with appointing Bob and Rachel at this moment. I think we should somehow leave it open so that, the new council members have that same opportunity.
Okay. I think what Mary and I were thinking was if there were two council members who were interested in the future in doing it, this would be a chance for them to get their feet wet. Well, Mary and I were still around to give any feedback and maybe give feedback to Jen if she wanted it. I'm happy to wait. I suppose Mary and I could do it, but it would be the least handoff council to council that we've done before, because the reason I came on was because Lisa Morzell was going off, and I could spend a year working with Lisa to learn kind of what the process looked like from the inside. And then we brought Mary in when Lisa was off, and we've had the COVID disruption. So it's a will of council. I think Mary and I will do as the remainder choose. We can certainly execute this and then just leave if that's the preference. Mark?
Yeah, I have to agree that we ought to have a little more continuity than that. The new council can appoint whoever they like, but it would be nice to have a couple of people in place for the next couple of months who are prepared to do it, who can be taught a little bit how to do it. And if that's not the will of the new council, that's up to them. But I think having some degree of continuity is an important thing. It doesn't preclude someone else in January from sticking their hand up and saying, I'd like to serve. And that decision can be made at the time. But simply having you guys just disappear in the first week of November and having nobody on council who has any preparation in this area, I don't think is a good thing. So I would be supportive of your suggestion, Sam.
Rachel and then Aaron.
Just for the record, this is not something I'm dying to do. So offering to do it to be helpful, but I don't see it as much about myself as making sure that staff has the council resource to get in place whatever we need in place for what sounds like maybe I don't want this to sound critical, but almost overdue evaluation. So, just making sure that we have the path for that staff needs. So happy to do or not do whatever is best for the city to function, and definitely happy to stand back if somebody new to council would like to do this.
Aaron.
Yeah, Ginny, I totally agree with your fundamental point there that if new council members are interested in doing this, they should absolutely have the right to step up, and we should be very willing to appoint them. So the one thing I feel about why I'm willing to move forward now is because we've let Judge Cook's evaluation go too long. So I would like to see that move forward sooner rather than later, which also should be really easy because Judge Cook is amazing. So, I think it'll be a relatively straightforward process. But Ginny, to your point, I certainly pledge, as somebody who will still be around in a few months when the new council comes on, to not give kind of incumbency to Bob and Rachel and to 100% consider new council members if they're interested in participating in this board committee.
Thank you, Aaron. Adam.
I agree with the extremely interim appointments.
Okay. Junie, would you like to follow up any further?
Well, I hear the rest of my colleagues and their comments about, going forward with the appointment. I still would not agree with it, but it is, again, the majority wants it. It's going forward, but I still disagree. And from what I heard from you earlier, the work doesn't have happen until sometime in the summer. So appointing these these two interim people, actually, to me, it already set the stage. It's similar to what happened when we had the mayor and the mayor pro tem appointments when I first got on council. But since this is the will of council, we will go with it.
Mary.
So just to clarify, the summer process was the old process. And the whole idea is to align, because there's 2 new employees. And as Aaron pointed out, we've let Judge Cook's evaluation go far too long. It's an opportunity to perform Judge Cook's evaluation now and take the opportunity that we have 2 new employees to align it with the January timeframe as opposed to waiting until summer. So the old method was out of step with the rest of the city employees by 6 months. And so the idea here is to align it to be in January with everybody else. So it wouldn't be waiting until summer. It needs to start happening now so that it's aligned by January 2022.
And I'll just say one further thing with that. It is quite possible that Mary and I could train's a loose word, just share what we've learned so far with the 2 new council people who get appointed. And if one of them wants to stay on and a new person wants to join them from, newly elected, that would be another way to pass some of the kind of how it's gone in the past and things to watch out for. Just because Mary and I could have done that with the 2 interim appointments. And then if one of them wanted to continue, there would at least be some continuity. And Mary's exactly right. This is going to come up, if we try and do this schedule alignment, it's going to come up for the new council right around the time of the retreat. So it's going to be a super topical thing. And so it sounds like the will of council is to move forward with some interim. I think that's smart. And Rachel and Bob have kind of been pushed forward. And if the rest of council is good with that, I think it would make sense for them to do it, for us to have a meeting publicly noticed if need be, where Mary and I spend some time just saying what we've seen, or we can do it informally, whatever makes the most sense. But the idea is just to make sure that we can pass some lessons learned to the new folks. So this is, Sandra, do we need to take any formal action if we want to appoint new committee members? I can't remember because we usually do this more retreat timeframe.
Right. I'd have to look and see. I'm not sure about that.
I think to be complete, why don't we just take a vote? So we'll go ahead and do this with a show of hands. If that works for everyone, we can have a motion. Somebody can make a motion to appoint Bob and Rachel as interim members of the Employee Evaluation Committee. And with that,
Sam,
I got Aaron, go ahead.
I apologize for interrupting out of turn, but I thought we'd agreed not to do motions under matters.
That's true. That's a good point. We can see if there's agreement and bring it forward on consent if we need to do a vote. Thank you for the process reminder. Thanks. I've got Mary, Aaron, and Mark.
That's an old hand.
Okay. Mark?
Yeah, we're not doing a formal motion, but I believe this is a punishment for which Bob and Rachel are perfectly suited, and I am prepared to inflict it upon them if they are willing to accept it.
Okay, so that's perfect. I think we have the will of council on that. And Sandra, if we need to, we can figure out if we need to bring a consent thing forward. We can handle that at CAC.
Sounds good.
It seems like we have acclamation for Rachel and Bob, noting that Junie has an objection to it, and we'll proceed with that. And if we need to, we'll bring it back on consent. Okay, is there anything else, Alicia, or are we done?
We are at the end of our agenda, sir.
Super. So I'll turn back to council. Any debrief, any other comments or staff? Aaron?
Was there going to be something on the city attorney tonight, or is that the next meeting?
The request came in to CAC for, I think, both the 14th and the 21st. Is that right, Bob?
Right.
Yep.
Okay, great, thanks.
Yeah.
I wanted to speak to that actually anyhow. Yeah, Aaron, it's not tonight, but I did want to flag, I think people will be getting an email for calendar holds, and to please pay attention to that because we're in such a tight turnaround and we will need to have calendars held, like, is it 2.5 weeks out, Bob? It's like 4 weeks. I don't know. It's sometime in the next month. People will need like a half day held. So please check your inbox for that.
It's a great reminder, and we will put the city attorney work that the council needs to do to tee that up at the next CAC. And the request has been for the 14th and the 21st to touch this. So, okay, anything else? All right, with that, our meeting is adjourned at 9:35 p.m. Everyone have a good rest of the week and see you on Tuesday next week.
Good night, everybody. The next meeting will be easier.
Good night.